Have you ever wondered why humans would leave the only world their bodies truly knew? In ordinary life, we stay close to what keeps us alive: water, food, shelter, family, and familiar paths. If that simple rule explained everything, early Homo sapiens should have remained in Africa, near the landscapes that shaped their bones, tools, memory, and survival. But that did not happen. Over many generations, human groups moved outward, crossing coastlines, dry lands, valleys, forests, and unknown edges of the world. So, where was the hidden pressure? Was it hunger, climate, changing animals, growing populations, or something quieter moving through the human story? The answer is not as simple as they wanted to explore. It may have begun with small steps repeated by people who never knew they were changing history. So why did humans leave Africa 70,000 years ago? And that is where the real story begins. If a living creature has water nearby, food within reach, shelter enough for the night, and familiar ground beneath its feet, the most reasonable thing is not to leave. This is true for animals, and it is true for people in ordinary life. A person does not walk away from a place that feeds the children, holds the dead, stores the memories of old paths, and offers at least some answer to hunger and danger. For early Homo sapiens, Africa was not simply a place on a map. It was the long beginning of the body itself. It was where the shape of the human hand had learned to hold stone, wood, skin, fire, and food. It was where the eye had learned the distance between grass and shadow, between a moving animal and a waiting danger. It was where children learned by watching older bodies bend toward water, listen for weather, and remember where the dry season had been kind before. If survival favored caution, then staying close to such a world should have been the safest answer. The deeper question is why that answer did not remain enough. When people imagine humans leaving Africa around 70,000 years ago, it is easy to picture a single group standing at the edge of a continent, choosing a direction and stepping into history. But ancient movement almost certainly did not feel like that from the inside. No one needed to know the shape of the planet. A family might only follow water a little farther than before. A small band might return to an old route and find it less generous. A child might grow up hearing that food had been better beyond a ridge, or that a coastline held shellfish when inland plants failed. These are not heroic reasons. They are human reasons, and they begin very close to the ground. In that sense, leaving Africa was not the opposite of belonging to Africa. It may have been one of the ways African humans had already learned to survive, by reading change, by walking when stillness became dangerous, by carrying memory from one place into another. The first pressure, then, may not have been the dream of a new world. It may have been the slow instability of the old one. Africa was vast, and it was never a single cradle with one climate and one kind of life. Some human groups lived near rivers and lakes. Some lived closer to grasslands, woodlands, coastlines, or dry country where water could disappear with a season. In such a world, home was not a fixed point. Home was a pattern, where water returned, where animals passed, where edible plants could be found, where stone could be shaped, where fire could be kept alive, where children could survive long enough to remember. If that pattern shifted, the people did not need to abandon home all at once. Home itself could move. This matters because the story of 70,000 years ago is sometimes told as if Africa simply pushed humans out. That is too simple. A changing environment does not speak with one voice. It narrows some places and opens others. It dries one route while making another possible. It separates groups and then, during wetter times, may allow them to meet, mix, and move again. For Homo sapiens, the decision to remain close to known landscapes may have remained strong for many generations. But known landscapes were not always faithful. A lake could shrink. A herd could alter its path. A familiar valley could become harder to feed. A shoreline could offer a quieter promise than the interior. Under those conditions, the safest choice might slowly change shape. The person who stayed alive was not always the person who stayed still. So the opening paradox remains. Humans came from Africa, were shaped by Africa, and depended on African knowledge. Yet some of their descendants moved beyond Africa's edges. The answer cannot begin with conquest, curiosity, or a clean arrow on a map. It must begin with the fragile logic of ordinary survival, where leaving is frightening, staying is reasonable, and yet the ground that once made staying possible begins to change. To understand why humans left Africa, it helps to remove one image from the mind: a crowd of people gathered at a boundary, looking outward, deciding together to leave the birthplace of their species. That picture is clean, but the real past was probably much quieter. For people living 70,000 years ago, there was no line named Africa in the way we use it now. There was no continent-shaped idea carried in the head. There were ridges, riverbeds, animal tracks, salty shores, dry wind, remembered trees, and the distance a child could walk before being carried. A group did not need to say, "We are leaving Africa." They only needed to move from one known place toward another place that seemed possible. One dry season could stretch a familiar journey a little farther. One generation could grow up using a camp that the previous generation had only visited. One old route could become a new home. This is how a great movement can begin without feeling great to the people inside it. It can begin as an adjustment, then a habit, then a memory passed to children, until what was once the edge of the known world becomes the center of someone else's childhood. That is why the question of leaving Africa must be handled slowly. Homo sapiens did not appear outside Africa fully separated from the world that made them. They carried African bodies, African skills, African social habits, and African memories into each new landscape. Their feet, lungs, hands, and eyes had been shaped in environments where walking, watching, gathering, carrying, and sharing mattered every day. Even when they moved beyond the old range, they were not starting again from nothing. They were extending a way of life that had already been tested inside Africa's changing spaces. A small band might follow animals along a valley after rains. Another might remain near a coastline because shellfish and fish made hunger less sharp. Others might move around lakes or seasonal rivers, not because they were chasing destiny, but because the next meal and the next safe night were never guaranteed. Over time, these movements could form a chain. No single link had to be dramatic. A grandmother might remember a water source beyond a dry plain. A young hunter might learn that certain animals returned after storms. A mother might choose a safer camp because children could sleep there with less risk. These choices are small only when viewed one at a time. Across hundreds and thousands of years, they become geography. The mistake is to imagine migration as one event, when it may have been more like breathing, a movement outward, a pause, a return, another outward movement, a settling, a loss, a new path opened. Some groups may have gone far and disappeared. Some may have mixed with other populations. Some may have left almost no trace at all. Others, later, survived long enough for their descendants to carry the story forward in their bodies. This is where the beginning of humans matters again. Our species did not begin as a creature of fixed borders. It began as a social animal living through uncertainty, dependent on memory and cooperation. A person alone was fragile. A group with shared knowledge was stronger. The old knew where water had lasted. Adults knew how to cut, carry, cook, watch, and repair. Children learned not through books, but through repeated days beside people who had survived before them. If a group moved, it moved with this invisible inheritance. Fire was not only heat, it was time extended into the night. Tools were not only stones, they were remembered gestures. Paths were not only ground, they were decisions made safe by those who had walked before. So the early movement out of Africa should not be imagined as a clean break from home. It may have been home stretching, thinning, breaking in some places, and reappearing in others. What mattered was not the pride of reaching somewhere new, but the plain fact of remaining alive when old patterns no longer held as firmly as before. And once that idea becomes clear, the central question changes. We are no longer asking why humans suddenly wanted to leave. We are asking how ordinary survival, repeated quietly through many generations, could carry an African species beyond Africa without anyone knowing they were crossing one of the deepest thresholds in human history. The first question in this story is not really about distance. It is about safety. Why would a species that began in Africa and had already survived there for a very long time allow some of its descendants to move into lands beyond the old human range? The simplest answer would be that they needed something they could not find where they were. But even that is not simple enough. Need does not always produce movement. Hunger can weaken a group until it cannot travel. Drought can trap people as easily as it can push them outward. Fear can keep a family near familiar ground even when that ground is becoming poor. So the true beginning of the question is more delicate. Something had to make movement possible, not only necessary. The old world had to become unstable enough to loosen people from familiar places, but not so broken that no one could survive the journey. There had to be pressure, but also pathways. There had to be loss, but also enough memory, skill, and social strength to carry life forward. This is why the phrase, "humans left Africa," can hide more than it reveals. It makes the story sound like a departure. In reality, it may have been a long negotiation between danger and possibility. A group might remain near a river for years, then move when the river no longer held through the dry months. Another group might follow herds toward greener ground after rainfall opened a passage. A third might live near a coast, where tides offered food when inland hunting became uncertain. These are not separate from the human beginning. They are the human beginning, continuing in motion. Homo sapiens emerged from African landscapes, where change was already part of life. To be human was not to live in perfect comfort. It was to notice, remember, share, and adjust. A dry season did not need to destroy a group in one dramatic moment. It could ask a question slowly. Where will the children drink next month? Where will the old people rest? Where will the firewood come from? Where will the animals go when this valley turns quiet? These questions do not sound like history, but they are the kind of questions that make history possible. They belong to bodies, not maps. They belong to feet that know tiredness, hands that carry tools, mothers who measure distance by the strength of children, and elders who remember places that younger people have never seen. If staying had been easy, movement would have been less likely. If movement had been impossible, staying would have become a trap. The human expansion beyond Africa required a narrow balance between the two. It required landscapes that changed, but did not close every route. It required groups that were small enough to move, but connected enough to preserve knowledge. It required bodies capable of walking long distances, but also social lives capable of protecting the weak. This is one of the deep differences between a simple migration story and a human survival story. A migration story draws an arrow. A survival story asks what had to happen before the arrow could exist. In the case of Homo sapiens, the arrow was made from climate, hunger, memory, tools, children, and time. It was made from thousands of ordinary decisions that no one recorded. A camp was abandoned, a water source was remembered, a shoreline was followed, a safer valley became familiar. A child born there later thought of that new place as home. Across many generations the edge moved, and because the edge moved, the question of leaving Africa becomes larger than escape. It becomes a question about how a species carries its beginning with it. The people who moved outward were not leaving behind the deep history of Africa as if closing a door. Their bodies still carried that history. Their ways of finding food, caring for children, reading landscapes, making tools, and surviving together had been shaped there. What changed was not the origin, but the range of places where that origin could continue. This is why the first answer cannot be a single cause. Climate alone is not enough. Hunger alone is not enough. Curiosity alone is too thin. The pressure had to pass through human bodies and human groups before it became movement. The land had to change in ways that made old answers weaker. The people had to respond in ways that made new answers possible. So before we ask which route they took, or which coast they followed, or which desert opened and closed, we have to stay with this quieter foundation. Humans may have left Africa because remaining in one familiar pattern was no longer the safest way to remain human. Africa was never one simple cradle. The word can make the beginning of Homo sapiens sound smaller than it was, as if early humans emerged from one plane, under one sky, with one kind of weather and one kind of danger. But the real continent was immense, varied, and restless. There were grasslands where herds moved with the seasons. There were wooded regions where shade, fruit, small animals, and hidden water mattered. There were rivers that could guide life across long distances, lakes that expanded and shrank, highlands that cooled the air, coastlines where tides exposed food, and dry lands where a familiar waterhole could become the difference between survival and disappearance. To say that humans began in Africa is true, but it is not enough. The beginning itself was not a single background. It was a changing field of many possible lives. This matters because the later movement out of Africa did not come from a species that had only learned one environment. Homo sapiens had already been shaped by a continent that required attention, flexibility, and memory. A group living near a lake had different daily problems from a group living near the edge of dry grassland. A group close to the coast could read tides and shells in ways that inland people did not need. A group near seasonal rivers might know when to move before the ground became too hard and the animals too scattered. These differences were not small details. They were part of how human minds and bodies learned to survive. The hand that shaped a stone tool did not work in an empty world. It worked because a person needed to cut meat, scrape hides, crack bones, process plants, or prepare food for a child. The foot that walked long distances did not walk for adventure. It followed water, shade, animals, firewood, stone, and safer ground. The eyes that watched the horizon were not looking at scenery. They were reading whether the land still held life. In this way, Africa did not simply hold early humans, it trained them in uncertainty. It taught them that survival could change from one valley to another, from one season to the next, from one generation to the next. If the environment had been stable everywhere, humans might have become more tied to narrow habits. But a varied Africa rewarded groups that could learn, remember, and shift without losing themselves. This is one reason the story of leaving Africa must begin inside Africa. Before any group reached the Levant, Arabia, Southern Asia, or farther lands, human populations had already lived with movement as part of ordinary life. Not movement across a modern map, but movement between water sources, hunting grounds, gathering places, shelters, and seasonal camps. A child born into such a group would not learn home as a single fixed point. Home might be a circuit of places, a remembered order of return, a pattern of dry months and wet months, a set of warnings and promises carried in the speech and gestures of older people. The origin of humans, then, was not just anatomical, it was ecological and social. It was a body shaped in Africa, but also a mind trained to connect places through memory. This deeper view makes the question of 70,000 years ago more careful. When descendants of African populations moved beyond the continent, they were not suddenly becoming mobile for the first time. They were extending a much older habit of reading landscapes and adjusting to them. The edge of Africa was not necessarily felt as an edge in the way we imagine it. A coastline might continue. A river corridor might lead onward. A greener phase might open ground that had once been too dry. A chain of usable places could stretch farther than before. For the people moving through it, the world may not have looked like departure. It may have looked like the next possible camp, and that is why the continent itself must be seen as active in the story. Africa was not a silent starting point left behind. It was the source of the skills that made later movement possible. Its variety had already tested human groups before they ever entered the wider world. Its shifting climates had already taught that no place was permanent in exactly the same way forever. Its landscapes had already shaped a species that could carry tools, fire, social memory, children, and knowledge across distance. So when we ask why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago, we are also asking what kind of Africa they came from. Not a simple birthplace, but a vast, changing home where staying alive had always meant noticing when the world was no longer the same as it had been before. Climate does not move human beings like a hand pushing stones across the ground. It works more slowly through seasons, water, plants, animals, and the limits of the human body. A place can become drier without becoming empty. A lake can shrink without vanishing. A valley can still hold life, but only for fewer weeks of the year. A region can remain familiar, yet become harder for children, older people, and tired adults to survive in. This is why climate belongs at the center of the story, but it must not be turned into a simple disaster. Humans did not leave Africa because one dry year suddenly told them to go. The pressure was likely older, quieter, and more uneven than that. Across many thousands of years, Africa passed through wetter and drier phases. Rivers changed their strength. Lakes expanded and withdrew. Grasslands spread, then retreated. Animals followed water and plants, and people followed the living patterns that fed them. For early Homo sapiens, this was not climate in the modern sense. It was not a graph, a date, or a scientific idea. It was the sound of insects near water, the distance to the next drinking place, the number of tracks left by animals after dawn, the worry in adults when a known source did not return as expected. The origin of humans was shaped inside this kind of moving world. A group that survived did not only know where to camp, it knew when to leave a camp before hunger became too sharp. It knew which direction might still hold shade, fruit, stone, firewood, or animal movement. It knew that a place could be generous in one generation and less generous in the next. This made Africa not a fixed cradle, but a living school of uncertainty. In wetter times, some lands that were once difficult may have opened. Green corridors could stretch across areas that later looked dry and empty. Lakes and seasonal rivers could create stepping stones of survival. Groups that had been separated might meet again, exchange partners, notice different tools, or learn paths that had been forgotten elsewhere. In drier times, those same connections could break apart. Populations could become smaller, more isolated, more dependent on local memory. This rhythm matters because the movement out of Africa may have grown from movements within Africa. Before people crossed beyond the continent's edges, they had already lived with the idea that the livable world could shift. A familiar home could become a harder home. A distant margin could become more promising. A coastline could matter more when inland plants failed. A river corridor could pull a group farther than their grandparents had gone. None of this required a plan to enter a new continent. It required only that one usable place led to another. The body itself kept the rules narrow. Humans could not move through pure emptiness. They needed drinkable water, enough food, safe resting places, and social cooperation strong enough to protect children and weaker members of the group. A route that looks open on a modern map would have meant nothing if it could not support daily life. A greener phase mattered only if it lasted long enough for people to move, settle, remember, and raise children. This is where climate becomes more than background. It rearranged possibility to make one valley less reliable while making another passage more usable. It could close a dry barrier, then open it again generations later. It could push gently from behind and invite gently from ahead. For Homo sapiens, the result was not one great departure, but a changing relationship with space. The first people who moved toward the edges of Africa may still have been doing what their ancestors had done for a very long time, reading the land, following life, avoiding hunger, keeping children close, and carrying knowledge from one camp to the next. In that sense, leaving Africa began before the border was crossed. It began when African humans learned that the world around them could move, and that survival sometimes meant moving with it. Before humans could leave Africa in a lasting way, they first had to become a species able to live with change inside Africa. This may sound simple, but it is one of the most important ideas in the whole story. A creature that survives only in one narrow setting can be strong there and helpless elsewhere. It can know one food, one season, one shelter, one path, and still fail when the world changes shape. Homo sapiens did not begin as a creature of perfect freedom. The body still needed water every day. Children still grew slowly. Injury could still become danger. Hunger could still weaken judgment. Yet over many generations, human groups learned to live across a wider range of African environments than a single origin story suggests. Some people knew rivers. Some knew lake edges. Some knew open grassland, wooded patches, rocky highlands, or coastal margins. Each place asked for a slightly different kind of memory. Each place taught the body and the group a different way to remain alive. This is why the movement out of Africa should not be imagined as the first great act of human flexibility. It was more likely the result of flexibility that had already been developing for a very long time. Inside Africa, people had to learn that food did not always return in the same place. They had to notice when animals changed their routes, when certain plants ripened, when water became unsafe or scarce, when a camp that once worked well could no longer hold a group through a difficult season. These lessons were not written down. They were carried in habits, gestures, stories, warnings, and the repeated behavior of older people. A child learned by walking behind adults, by watching which stones were chosen, which plants were ignored, which tracks mattered, which direction the group took when the air became dry. In this way, Africa shaped not only the human body, but the human method of survival. It made memory practical. It made cooperation necessary. It made movement something that could be learned before it became expansion. The same species that later moved into Arabia, the Levant, southern Asia, and beyond, had already been trained by a continent where staying alive meant adjusting without losing continuity. This matters because the phrase leaving Africa can sound like separation from the source, but the source travelled with the people. It travelled in how they shared food, how they protected children, how they kept fire, how they made tools, how they read weather, how they remembered water. When a group moved into a new landscape, they were not empty bodies entering empty space. They were African humans carrying African adaptations into new conditions. Some of those adaptations may have worked well. Others may have needed to change. A tool useful in one place might be modified in another. A food habit might fail where plants were different. A route might end in dry ground. A shoreline might provide new possibilities, but only for people who could learn its rhythm. So movement beyond Africa was not only a matter of walking. It was a test of whether inherited knowledge could bend without breaking. The deeper picture is not that one day humans became explorers. It is that the old African lesson widened. If the livable world shifts, the group must shift with it. Sometimes that shift might be small, only a few miles toward water. Sometimes it might last for a season. Sometimes a temporary camp might become a place where children were born, and those children might grow up with a different sense of where home began. Across many generations, such changes could stretch the human range outward. No one needed to see the whole movement. No one needed to know that descendants would one day live far from Africa. The path could be built from local choices, each one shaped by hunger, safety, weather, memory, and care. This is where Africa becomes even more central, not less. The ability to leave did not mean the origin had been escaped. It meant the origin had produced a way of life strong enough to travel. Homo sapiens could begin to move beyond the continent because, within the continent, they had already learned that survival was not a fixed place. It was a relationship between bodies, landscapes, tools, and generations. When that relationship could be carried farther, the edge of the human world began to move as well. The number 70,000 years ago can sound more exact than the ancient world allows. It gives the mind a clean doorway. Before it, humans were mostly inside Africa. After it, they began to spread beyond it. But deep history rarely opens, like a door, on a single date. It is more like a shoreline seen through mist. The closer we look, the more edges appear. Some are made by fossils, some are made by stone tools, some are made by ancient climates, and some are made by DNA carried in living people today. Together, they suggest that 70,000 years ago was not a single moment when Homo sapiens suddenly left Africa for the first time. It was more likely a broad and important stretch of time, a turning zone, when movements that had happened before became part of a larger and more lasting human expansion. This distinction matters, because if we treat the date too simply, we create a false story. Humans did not wake up in one generation and become global. They had already existed in Africa for a long time. They had already moved across African landscapes. They had already adapted to changing rivers, coastlines, woodlands, grasslands, and dry regions. And there is evidence that some Homo sapiens, or closely related early modern human populations, reached areas outside Africa before the main ancestry of most later non-African peoples spread widely. Those earlier movements remind us that leaving Africa was not impossible before 70,000 years ago. The harder question is why some movements faded, while later movements became part of the ancestry of so many people alive today. To understand that, 70,000 years ago should be heard less as a sharp date and more as a gathering of conditions. The human world was changing, but not in one place only. Climate had opened and closed routes many times. Populations inside Africa were not all the same or all living together. Some groups may have been separated by dry regions, then reconnected when wetter conditions returned. Tools and behaviours were not frozen. Ways of making stone tools, using fire, moving through landscapes, and sharing knowledge could shift gradually. Even small improvements in memory, cooperation, or survival could matter over many generations. A group did not need to be dramatically different from those before it to leave a larger mark. It only needed to move at the right time, through a livable route, with enough people, enough children, enough knowledge, and enough continuity for the movement not to disappear. This brings the story back to the origin of humans in Africa. The people connected to later expansions were not detached from their beginning. Their bodies still belonged to an African history of walking, carrying, sweating, watching, learning, and depending on others. Their survival still rested on ordinary needs: water, food, shelter, safety, care for children, and memory of places. What may have changed around this broad period was not a single desire to explore, but the balance between those needs and the spaces available to meet them. When a route beyond Africa became more usable, it still had to be lived day by day. When a small population moved outward, it still had to raise children in unfamiliar conditions. When people entered new regions, they still carried the old African problem with them. How does a fragile human group remain alive when the landscape cannot be trusted to stay the same? That is why the number 70,000 should not be treated as magic. It is useful because it points us toward a major chapter in the human story, but it should not replace the story itself. Before that time, there were earlier attempts, earlier traces, earlier possibilities. Around and after that time, certain movements became more enduring. The difference may have depended on climate, routes, population structure, social learning, and chance working together. A dry corridor at the wrong time could stop a group. A wetter passage at the right time could carry another group farther. A small population could vanish without leaving descendants. Another, only slightly luckier or better connected, could become the beginning of a wider human presence across the world. So the question is not simply what happened 70,000 years ago. The deeper question is why that broad period became one of the moments when movement out of Africa stopped being only a temporary reach and began to become a lasting branch of human history. There were humans who reached beyond Africa before the broad expansion connected with later non-African ancestry. This is one of the quiet facts that makes the story more complex and more honest. If we imagine 70,000 years ago as the first moment anyone crossed out of Africa, the past becomes too neat. Evidence from fossils, stone tools, and ancient landscapes suggests that earlier Homo sapiens populations, or closely related early modern humans, had already moved into nearby regions outside the continent at different times. Some reached the eastern Mediterranean. Some may have followed routes through greener corridors when climates allowed. Some may have lived for a while in places that were not deeply separate from Africa in daily experience, because coastlines, river valleys, and open lands could connect lives more gently than a modern map suggests. Yet many of these earlier movements seem to have left little or no lasting genetic trace in most people living outside Africa today. That does not make them unimportant. It makes them part of a larger question. Why could one human movement reach outward and fade, while another, later movement became the beginning of a much wider human presence? The answer cannot be that earlier people were not human enough. That would be too simple and not fair to the evidence. They had bodies like ours in the broad sense. They could make tools, move through landscapes, care for children, and learn from one another. But survival outside a familiar range does not depend only on intelligence or courage. It depends on timing, routes, population size, climate, food, water, disease, contact with other human groups, and plain chance. A small group can reach a new land and still disappear after several generations. Children may not survive well enough. The climate may shift against them. A route back to related groups may close. Food knowledge may not transfer easily into a new environment. A drought, a cold phase, or isolation can erase a population without leaving a clear story behind. This is important for the question of leaving Africa around 70,000 years ago, because it shows that movement and success were not the same thing. Humans could leave and not endure. They could reach new places and still fail to become ancestors of the future. The deeper story is not only about the first footsteps outside Africa, but about which footsteps continued. From the viewpoint of the people living then, an earlier movement may not have felt like failure at all. A group might have lived for many generations beyond Africa's edge, raised children, made camps, hunted animals, gathered plants, and watched seasons change. Their world was complete to them. They did not know whether their descendants would last for 10 generations or 10,000. They were not trying to become evidence. They were simply trying to remain alive. This brings us back to the African beginning. Homo sapiens emerged from a continent where populations were already shaped by separation and reconnection. Some groups may have lived apart for long periods, then met again when climates shifted. Knowledge could spread, then narrow, then spread again. A movement beyond Africa was another version of this pattern, but with greater risk. Once people moved into new regions, they might become cut off from the wider human network that had helped preserve knowledge and partners. A small, isolated population can be fragile even when each person is capable. Social life needs enough people to remember paths, maintain skills, exchange mates, care for the young, and recover after loss. If the group becomes too small, the problem is not only hunger, it is continuity. A tool-making tradition can weaken. A remembered route can die with an elder. A good camp can be lost if no child survives to learn it. This is why earlier departures could be real and still not lead to a lasting expansion. They may have reached outward before the right combination of conditions existed. Later, around the broad period we call 70,000 years ago and after, something about the balance may have changed. Routes may have been more usable. Populations may have been better connected. Human groups may have carried more stable knowledge across generations. The climate may have opened enough stepping stones for movement to continue. None of these alone explains everything, but together they help us see why the story is not simply that humans left Africa once. It is that many human edges were tested, and only some became roads into the wider world. If earlier humans had already moved beyond Africa, then the greater mystery becomes sharper. Why did later movements matter more? Why did some journeys vanish from the deep record, while others became part of the ancestry of people spread across much of the world? The answer must be approached with care, because ancient survival was never decided by one cause alone. It was not enough to be physically modern. It was not enough to know how to make tools. It was not enough to walk far. A group could possess all of these and still disappear if the timing was wrong, if the route became dry, if children did not survive, if contact with other groups was too limited, or if a new landscape asked for knowledge that the group had not yet built. The difference between an earlier movement that faded and a later movement that endured may have been small at first, almost invisible to the people living through it. A few more children surviving, a few more groups connected across distance, a coastline holding food through a hard season, a river corridor remaining usable for longer than before. These small conditions can become large only when time carries them forward. Around the broad period often described as 70,000 years ago, the human world may have reached a different balance. Not a magical change, and not a sudden awakening, but a set of conditions that made lasting expansion more possible. Populations inside Africa may have been linked in ways that preserved skills and allowed movement without total isolation. Environmental windows may have opened certain paths out of the continent, at least for long enough that groups could move, settle, reproduce, and continue. Social knowledge may have become more stable, not because humans became perfect thinkers, but because repeated learning across generations gave groups more ways to manage uncertainty. This is where the story returns to the African source again. Homo sapiens did not leave Africa by shedding their origin. They left by carrying it. The body that moved outward was an African body, shaped by heat, walking, endurance, cooperation, long childhood, and dependence on shared knowledge. The mind that entered new lands had been trained by African variability, wetter and drier phases, changing animal movements, shifting water sources, and the need to live with others. If later movements endured, it may be because the people moving were not simply escaping one place. They were extending a flexible way of life that had already been tested in many places. Still, this should not be turned into a story of guaranteed success. Many groups likely remained fragile. Some may have reached new regions and later died out. Some may have mixed with other populations. Some may have been absorbed into larger movements that came after them. In deep history, survival is often less like victory and more like continuity. The group that leaves the clearest trace is not always the group that was first, strongest, or most daring. It may be the group whose children survived at the right time, whose neighbours were close enough, whose roots stayed open long enough, and whose knowledge did not break when the land changed. This is why the later expansion out of Africa cannot be explained by a single arrow on a map. A map hides the weakness of bodies. It hides thirst, childbirth, injury, confusion, loss, and the need to remember where safety once stood. It also hides the quiet strength of human groups, the sharing of food, the carrying of children, the teaching of hands, the watching of weather, the trust placed in elders who remembered a route beyond the known camp. When these things held together, distance became possible. When they failed, distance became danger. So the turning point was not simply that humans left Africa. The turning point was that, in some later movements, the chain did not break. One camp led to another. One generation left enough memory for the next. One edge of the familiar world became livable long enough for children to call it home. Earlier movements had shown that the door could open. Later movements showed that a population could pass through and continue. And this is where the question begins to widen. The mystery is not only why humans moved outward, but why, in that long and uncertain period, movement finally began to leave a lasting human future beyond Africa. Climate can sound like a large word, but for a human body it becomes very small and immediate. It becomes the question of whether the next water is close enough. It becomes the weight of a child carried farther than usual. It becomes the silence of grass where animals once moved, the thinness of roots in dry soil, the danger of sleeping in a place where the group has already stayed too long. When we ask why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago, climate is often placed near the beginning of the answer, but it should not be imagined as a single violent force that suddenly drove people out. The ancient world did not need one great catastrophe to change human movement. It only needed many seasons in which old certainties became less reliable. A river did not need to vanish forever. It only needed to fail at the wrong time. A hunting ground did not need to become empty. It only needed to feed fewer people. A dry region did not need to become impossible for every creature. It only needed to make life harder for mothers, children, injured adults, and elders who carried memory. This is how environmental pressure works in human history. It enters through the weakest points of ordinary life. Homo sapiens began in Africa within landscapes that had always changed, but some changes would have mattered more than others. A wetter phase could spread grass and water across places that were usually difficult. A drier phase could pull life back into smaller pockets. Animals that people followed might shift their routes. Plants that were gathered in one season might become tinganabella. Camps that once held a group through part of the year might no longer support them. None of these changes required people to understand global climate. They only had to feel that the old pattern was no longer enough. This is the key difference between a dramatic story and a truthful one. Humans were probably not pushed out of Africa by one simple disaster. They were shaped by repeated adjustments, each one small enough to belong to daily life, but large enough over time to change where people could live. A family might move earlier in the dry season than before. A group might test a route that older people remembered only as temporary. Another group might spend more time near a coast because tides offered food when inland resources became uncertain. These movements did not have to look like migration. They could look like caution. They could look like hunger being delayed one more day. They could look like parents choosing the place where children had the best chance to sleep, drink, and wake again. The African origin of humans matters here because our species did not first learn survival in a stable world. It learned survival in a continent of shifting opportunities. The body could walk, but the body also tired. The mind could remember, but memory could fail if the land changed too quickly. The group could cooperate, but cooperation had limits when food became scarce. Climate did not simply push people outward. It tested whether the human way of life could stretch. In some periods, it may have narrowed habitable areas and forced groups to concentrate near water. In other periods, it may have opened corridors through regions that had been too dry before. This means the same force could create pressure behind and possibility ahead. A shrinking lake could make staying harder. A greener passage beyond the known range could make moving possible. Hunger alone could trap people. A route with water could turn hunger into movement. That balance is essential. If the world becomes too harsh, movement dies. If it becomes too easy, there may be no reason to move far. The important moments are often in between, when familiar life becomes uncertain but not yet impossible, and when the next landscape offers enough promise to be tried. So climate should be heard as a slow rearrangement of choices. It did not command humans to leave Africa. It changed the meaning of staying. It made some old answers weaker and some distant answers more visible. And in a world where survival depended on reading water, animals, plants, and seasons, even a small shift repeated across generations could move the edge of humanity farther than anyone intended. For a small human group, the world was not divided into continents, countries, or borders. It was divided into places that could keep people alive and places that could not. A river was not only a river. It was drinking water, animal movement, edible plants, wet mud, shade, and a path through the land. A coastline was not only the edge of the sea, it was tides, shellfish, fish, birds, driftwood, fresh water nearby if the group was fortunate, and a long line that could be followed without losing direction. A grassland was not only open space, it was where herds might pass, where danger could be seen from a distance, and where fire, wind, and season could change everything. When climate shifted, these living spaces shifted with it. The question was never simply whether the world was warm or cold, wet or dry. The question was whether the pattern that supported human life still connected one usable place to another. Inside Africa, Homo sapiens had already lived with this kind of pattern for countless generations. The origin of our species was not a single fixed camp. It was a network of remembered places, some used often, some used rarely, some visited only when the year became difficult. People did not need to know that climate was changing across a continent. They only needed to notice that the water they expected was lower, that the animals had not come as before, that a plant patch had failed, that a safer camp was now too crowded, or that another route still held signs of life. In that quiet way, the environment could begin to loosen people from a place without forcing them into emptiness. A group might move toward a river valley because dry land behind them no longer fed them well. Another might remain near lake margins while the water lasted, then follow animals when the lake drew back. Another might move along a coast because the sea offered food in repeated rhythms, even when inland resources became uncertain. These choices were practical, not symbolic. They were not about leaving Africa as an idea. They were about staying close to life as life itself moved. This is where the idea of corridors becomes important. A corridor was not a road. It was a chain of survivable spaces. A wetter climate could turn a harsh region into a landscape with temporary lakes, grasses, animals, and seasonal water. A dry period could break that same chain into dangerous gaps. For humans, a corridor only mattered if it could be crossed slowly enough for bodies to endure and families to continue. Adults could not simply rush through unknown land. Children needed rest. Pregnant women needed protection. Elders could carry memory, but they also needed care. Tools had to be carried. Fire had to be maintained or remade. Food had to be found day after day. A passage out of Africa, whether through northeastern routes, river systems, or coastal margins, would have been meaningful only if it supported these ordinary needs. This makes the story much less like a march and much more like a sequence of livable pauses. A group could move to one camp, remain there, learn it, raise children there, and then another generation might move farther. The edge of the known world could advance without any single person walking the whole distance. What climate may have done was not simply push people from behind, but create these pauses ahead. It could make the old home less dependable while also making distant ground more reachable. That double movement is essential. If Africa had only become harsher, people might have suffered and shrunk in place. If routes beyond Africa had remained closed, movement could not become lasting expansion. But when pressure and passage overlapped, the safest choice could shift. Remaining where ancestors had lived might no longer be the best way to preserve the ancestral way of life. Moving could become a form of continuity. The human beginning travelled inside the group, in the way people read tracks, shared food, carried children, remembered water, and watched the sky. So when we imagine ancient humans near the edge of Africa, it is better not to see them as people escaping a continent. It is better to see them following connected pieces of survival. One water source led to another. One season opened what another season had closed. One remembered path became useful again. One new camp became familiar enough for children to grow. The land did not give a command. It offered and withdrew. Human groups answered not with a single decision, but with movement shaped by need, patience, fear, and memory. The slow pressure of climate becomes clearer when we remember that people did not move through ideas. They moved through bodies. A dry season was not only an environmental event. It was thirst in the mouth, weaker legs at the end of the day, fewer foods to share, longer walks between safe places, and more difficult choices about when to move. A wetter season was not only a better climate. It could be new grass on land that had been hard before, animals passing through again, shallow lakes shining in old basins, and a route that elders had heard about but younger people had never seen. For early Homo sapiens, these changes were not abstract patterns. They were lived as the difference between a camp that could hold a group and a camp that had to be left. This is why the movement out of Africa may have begun as a quiet reading of limits. A group did not need to be desperate beyond all hope. In fact, if desperation became too complete, travel might become impossible. People needed enough strength to walk, enough food to carry, enough children surviving, enough adults cooperating, and enough knowledge to choose a direction. Climate could create the problem, but it also had to leave some form of answer. A familiar water source becoming unreliable might push a group outward. A chain of temporary water sources ahead might allow that outward movement to continue. Without both sides, pressure and possibility, the story would break. This balance is deeply connected to the African beginning of our species. Homo sapiens had developed in a world where survival was never separate from movement, but movement had to remain careful. Too much risk could end a group. Too much stillness could slowly weaken it. The people who moved toward Africa's edges carried habits learned in this long school of uncertainty. They knew that a path was not only distance, it was food along the way, shade when heat rose, stone for tools, dry ground for sleeping, water close enough for children, and signs that other animals could live there too. If animals could not move through a place, humans often could not remain there for long either. If plants failed, people had to read the failure before hunger erased their choices. Such knowledge was not held by one heroic individual. It lived across the group. It lived in older memory, in shared observation, in repeated walks, in the careful teaching of children. When climate shifted, this social memory could turn a dangerous change into a possible route. The land itself may have opened in pulses. A green phase in North Africa or Arabia could create passages that were later swallowed again by dryness. A coastline could become more useful when inland resources were uncertain. A river corridor could guide people beyond the range their grandparents knew. These possibilities should not be imagined as clear highways. They were fragile, uneven, and temporary. A route might be useful for a few generations, and then close. A group might move outward and later be cut off. Another might return, mix, or disappear. Yet over deep time, even temporary openings mattered. They allowed human groups to test the edge. They allowed knowledge to stretch. They allowed children to be born in places that had once been only distant margins. This is how the meaning of home could slowly change. The first generation might remember the old camp as the center. The next might remember the new camp and the old camp together. A later generation might know the older place only through stories, while the newer landscape became the ground of ordinary life. By then, no one had to feel that they had left Africa in a single dramatic act. The human range had simply widened through the repeated search for livable ground, so climate did not write the story alone. It worked through water, animals, coastlines, dry corridors, green windows, and the fragile needs of human families. It changed where life could continue, and people followed that continuation when they could. The deeper lesson is that leaving Africa was not a rejection of the human beginning. It was one of the ways that beginning survived when the old pattern of safety became less stable. The first steps outward were not steps away from humanity's source. They were steps made by African humans carrying their source with them through a world that kept asking them to move carefully or be left behind. Before humans drew maps, food drew the first map for them. It marked the land in ways no line could show, where animals passed after rain, where roots could be dug from soft soil, where fruit appeared for a short season, where birds gathered near water, where shellfish could be collected when the tide moved out. For early Homo sapiens, the world was not understood first as territory. It was understood as nourishment, risk, distance, and return. A place was meaningful because it could feed the body, and because the group remembered how to use it. This is one of the simplest and deepest reasons the movement out of Africa cannot be separated from daily hunger. People did not need to want a new world. They needed the next reliable meal. In the African landscapes where our species began, food was never one thing. It could be meat from a hunted or scavenged animal, marrow cracked from bone, fish or shellfish near water, tubers hidden underground, fruit ripening in a narrow window, seeds, nuts, honey, leaves, and small animals taken when chance allowed. Each food had its own season, place, tool, and memory. A group that survived was not only strong, it was attentive. It knew which foods were worth the effort, which signs meant animals had passed recently, which plants could be eaten, which places became dangerous when water shrank, and which camp could support children for more than a few days. The human body carried these needs quietly. It needed calories before it could travel. It needed water before it could think clearly. It needed enough rest before it could hunt, gather, carry, and protect. Hunger did not always create movement, but it shaped the direction of movement. A hungry group might follow the tracks of animals into a valley that had become greener. A group near a shrinking lake might move along its edge as food concentrated in fewer places. A coastal group might remain close to tides, because the sea could offer repeated chances when inland food became less certain. These movements were not random. They followed the geography of nourishment. This is why food can be thought of as the first human map. It was not drawn on skin or stone. It was stored in the bodies and memories of people. An elder might remember that a certain dry plain was dangerous, except after rare rains. A skilled gatherer might know that a plant with little value in one season became useful in another. A hunter might read the movement of animals as a sign of water beyond sight. A mother might judge a route by whether children could be fed along the way. These kinds of knowledge linked places together. They made a path more than empty distance. They turned land into a chain of possible survival. And first, the origin of humans in Africa was deeply tied to this kind of remembered food landscape. Homo sapiens did not emerge as a species that could live anywhere without learning. It emerged as a species that could learn from others, combine different foods, adjust to scarcity, and carry practical knowledge across generations. That flexibility mattered because African environments were diverse and changing. When rain shifted, the food map shifted with it. When herds moved, people had to decide whether to follow. When plants failed in one place, another place might become more important. When coastlines offered dependable resources, they could pull human attention toward long edges of land and water. The movement beyond Africa may have begun where such food maps stretched outward. A river corridor, a greener passage, or a coast was not important simply because it allowed walking. It was important because it allowed eating while walking. Without food, a route was only danger. With food, it could become a memory, then a habit, then a home for the next generation. This changes the way we hear the question of why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago. It was not only climate, and it was not only curiosity. It was the quiet pressure of feeding bodies in a changing world. If the animals moved, the human map moved. If water retreated, the human map tightened. If a new edge of land offered food often enough, the human map lengthened. Over time, the search for nourishment could carry people beyond the places their ancestors had known, not because they were chasing the unknown, but because life itself kept appearing a little farther ahead. When animals moved, people had to decide whether to move with them. This was not a simple choice. A herd crossing a valley could mean meat, hides, bones, fat, tools, and days of food for the group. But following animals also meant leaving familiar ground, walking into uncertain weather, and trusting that the next place would still offer water and shelter. For early Homo sapiens, animals were not only prey, they were signs moving across the landscape. Their tracks could point toward grass, water, shade, and seasonal change. Their absence could be just as meaningful. A place where animals no longer passed might still look familiar, but it had become poorer in a way the body would soon feel. Hunger often begins before starvation. It begins when the group must walk farther for the same amount of food, when children wait longer between meals, when adults return with less, when old people eat quietly so others can have more. In such conditions, movement could become less like a bold decision and more like the least dangerous answer. The human origin in Africa was tied to this careful attention to living patterns. Homo sapiens did not survive by strength alone. People survived by reading relationships between rain and grass, grass and herds and predators, water and gathering places, coast and tide, stone and tool, fire and food. If one part of the pattern moved, the rest could shift with it. A group might follow grazing animals after rain opened new ground. Another might follow birds or fish near water. Another might move between inland resources and coastal foods depending on the season. These were not migrations in the grand historical sense. They were food decisions repeated across a wide and changing continent. Yet over many generations, food decisions can become population movement. A camp used only during one season can become more important if other places fail. A valley once visited rarely can become a safer centre. A coastline once used as a margin can become a long guide across distance. This is how the search for food could quietly stretch the human world. It did not require anyone to imagine Asia, Europe, or Australia. It required only that the next usable place appeared beyond the last familiar one. Still, food alone could not pull people anywhere unless the group knew how to use what it found. A landscape full of life is not automatically a landscape humans can survive in. Shellfish matter only if people know where and when to collect them. Large animals matter only if people can track, process, share, and protect the meat. Plants matter only if someone remembers which ones nourish and which ones harm. Even water matters differently depending on where it lies, how long it lasts, and what dangers gather around it. This is where knowledge becomes as important as food itself. Early humans carried a map made of memory. That map included places, seasons, gestures, warnings, and techniques. It lived in the group rather than in one mind. The older people remembered routes. Skilled hands remembered how to shape stone. Parents remembered which foods could be given to children. Watchful adults remembered where predators waited and where water returned after rain. When people moved, this map moved with them, but it had to be tested again in each new place. Some knowledge would work. Some would fail. Some would be changed slowly until the group could live with different plants, different animals, different coastlines, and different risks. This helps explain why leaving Africa was not simply walking away from hunger. Hunger could weaken a group until no movement was possible. But when food patterns shifted outward in usable steps, hunger could become direction. If animals moved beyond a familiar range and water still connected the route, people might follow. If coastlines offered repeated food, people might remain near them and slowly extend their range. If inland resources became uncertain, the edge of survival could move toward rivers, lakes, and shores. In this sense, food was not just something humans searched for. Food shaped the shape of human memory. It told groups where to return, when to wait, and when to leave. The descendants of African populations who eventually moved beyond the continent may have done so because the living map they followed did not stop at the old boundary. It continued through animals, water, shorelines, plants, and seasons. The world did not say, "Leave Africa." It offered food in one place, withdrew it from another, and let human bodies discover that survival sometimes lay just beyond the known edge. The search for food changes the meaning of leaving. It makes the movement out of Africa less like abandoning a homeland and more like following the edges of life as those edges shifted. A person who walks toward water is not rejecting the place behind them. A group that follows animals is not choosing exile. A family that stays near a coast because the tide feeds them is not thinking in the language of continents. They are staying close to what keeps the body alive. This is why the question of why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago must be tied to nourishment in a very ordinary way. Food was not only the reason to stop, it was also the reason to continue. If the familiar ground no longer fed a group well enough, and if another place ahead offered even a modest chance, then movement could become a form of staying alive. Africa remained the source, But the livable pattern that had begun there may have stretched beyond the old range. The human beginning was never separate from this pattern. Homo sapiens emerged as a creature that needed many kinds of food, not one perfect food. Meat mattered, but so did plants. Fat mattered, but so did roots, seeds, fruits, shellfish, fish, marrow, honey, and whatever a group could safely gather or process. This wide diet did not mean life was easy. It meant survival required knowledge. A body could be hungry in a rich landscape if the mind and the group did not know how to use it. A coast full of shells could be useless to people who did not understand tides. A dry plain could hide edible roots from people who did not know when to dig. A herd could pass too far away to matter unless hunters could read the land, prepare tools, and share the risk. So food did not simply sit in the world waiting for humans. It had to be recognized, remembered, reached, processed, and shared. That is why food became a map made of relationships. It joined the body to the season to the landscape to memory, and memory to the next generation. When that map changed, people changed with it. A familiar valley might no longer hold enough animals. A lake margin might become crowded as water pulled back. A river corridor might grow more important because it connected several usable places. A coastline might offer a slower, steadier rhythm of food that made movement along its edge possible. None of this required a single great departure. The movement could happen through small choices that look sensible only in the moment. Stay near the water a little longer. Follow the animals one valley farther. Return to a camp that used to be temporary. Keep moving along a shore because each new inlet offers something to eat. Over generations, these ordinary choices could lengthen the human world. The old home was not erased. It was repeated in new ground. A campfire outside Africa still depended on knowledge shaped in Africa. A child fed beside a new river still belonged to a species whose body and social life had been formed in African landscapes. Hands still shaped stone. Adults still carried children. Elders still remembered places. Food was still shared because one person's success could keep another person alive. This continuity matters because it prevents a false picture of migration as pure escape. The people moving outward were not simply running from hunger. They were following the possibility of food through a changing world. Sometimes that possibility failed. Some routes closed. Some groups may have vanished. Some knowledge may have been lost when populations became too small or too isolated. But where food, water, social memory, and time remained connected, movement could continue. A place beyond the old range could become not an unknown wilderness, but a new center of survival. The child born there would not remember the first step outward. That child would know the smell of the local fire, the sound of local water, the paths adults used, and the foods that returned with the season. In that child's life, the edge would no longer feel like an edge. This may be one of the quietest explanations for why humans left Africa. The world did not pull them toward adventure. It arranged nourishment unevenly. It made some familiar places less dependable and some farther places possible. And because human beings were bodies before they were travelers, the map they followed was first drawn by hunger, water, memory, and the fragile hope that the next place could feed another generation. The human body is not the strongest body in nature, but it is a body made for distance in a particular way. It can stand upright, balance the head above the spine, free the hands, and carry food, tools, firewood, or a sleeping child. It can walk for hours when the pace is steady. It can sweat to release heat. It can look across open ground while moving. These abilities matter when we ask why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago, because no movement through changing landscapes could happen unless the body itself could endure the journey. But this should not be turned into a story of easy travel. A body able to walk far is still a fragile body. It needs water often. It loses strength when hungry. It bleeds when cut. It weakens under infection. It slows when carrying children. It suffers in cold, heat, fear, and exhaustion. So the outward movement of Homo sapiens was not simply possible because humans could walk. It was possible only when walking could be supported by food, water, tools, social care, and memory. The origin of our species in Africa had already shaped this balance between endurance and vulnerability. Early humans were not built like animals that could survive alone by speed, claws, or thick hides. They survived by combining bodies with knowledge. A single person was limited, but a group could do more. One adult could carry a child while another carried tools. Someone could remember the route to water. Someone could watch the horizon. Someone could gather plants while others searched for animals. Someone injured might still survive if the group slowed, shared, or protected. This is one of the hidden reasons the human body could leave Africa. It did not leave as an isolated machine of movement. It left inside a social body. Each person's weakness was partly covered by another person's strength. Each generation inherited not only bones and muscles, but ways of using them together. Walking mattered because it connected places. Hands mattered because they carried more than the body alone could hold. Feet mattered because survival often lay beyond the nearest camp. But none of these worked without the group. A route out of Africa would have tested every part of this system. Long movement meant tired legs, worn feet, thirst, and uncertainty. It meant judging how far children could go before rest. It meant deciding whether an elder's memory was worth the slower pace, which it often could be because knowledge of water or weather might save everyone. It meant carrying tools that were heavy enough to matter, but light enough to move with. It meant choosing camps not only by comfort, but by safety, fuel, visibility, and nearness to food. The human body could travel, but only through constant negotiation with its limits. This is why endurance should be understood gently, not as athletic triumph, but as a survival pattern. A group did not need to run into the unknown. It needed to keep moving without falling apart. It needed to recover after each stage. It needed to raise children along the way, because without children surviving, movement left no future. In this sense, human biology shaped the pace of history. The expansion beyond Africa could not move faster than water, food, pregnancy, childhood, injury, and memory allowed. The slow growth of children is especially important. Human children depend on adults for a long time. This makes humans vulnerable, but it also makes learning deep. A child who walks beside older people learns landscapes slowly. The child learns where to look, what to touch, what to avoid, how tools are made, how food is shared, and when silence means danger. If that child survives in a new place, the new place becomes part of human knowledge. The body carries the species outward, but childhood lets the new world be learned and remembered. This makes the human body both the vehicle and the limit of leaving Africa. It could cross distance, but not empty distance. It could enter new lands, but not without care. It could endure, but not forever without rest. The outward movement of Homo sapiens was therefore not a simple march of strong bodies across the world. It was a slow extension of African bodies supported by social life, carrying fragile needs through changing landscapes. The body made movement possible, but its weakness made cooperation necessary. A human body can walk far, but it cannot walk away from its own dependence. This is one of the quiet truths behind the movement out of Africa. Homo sapiens had endurance, hands, memory, and tools, but every person still carried the same basic needs that shaped life at the beginning of our species. The body needed water before pride, food before direction, rest before courage, and other people before long survival. A strong adult might travel across difficult ground for many hours, but a group was not made only of strong adults. There were children who tired quickly, pregnant women who needed care, older people whose memory could be valuable but whose bodies could slow the pace, injured adults who might recover if the group did not abandon them, and infants who could not choose anything at all. This is why the story of leaving Africa cannot be imagined only through the legs of hunters or the strength of travelers. It must be imagined through the whole living group. The journey had to include the weakest bodies, because the future of the group lived inside them. A population that moved but failed to keep children alive would leave no lasting trace. A group that walked far but lost its older knowledge might survive for a time and then become fragile. The outward movement of humans depended on the body, but the body was never enough by itself. It needed a social world wrapped around it. In the African landscapes where Homo sapiens began, this social world had already become essential. Human infants are born helpless compared with many animals. They grow slowly, They require feeding, carrying, watching, teaching, and protection for many years. This long childhood made movement harder, but it also made human learning deeper. A child carried along a route did not understand the route at first. Later, the same child might remember where water was found, where a camp was safe, where certain animals passed, and where adults had once decided to turn back. In this way, the burden of childhood became a vessel of memory. The slow-growing human body made groups vulnerable in the short term, but stronger across generations if enough children survived to learn. This balance mattered deeply outside Africa's old range. New landscapes could not be solved by instinct alone. A group needed time to learn what plants were useful, what animals could be followed, what stones could be shaped, what weather signs mattered, and where danger gathered. If children grew up in such a place, the strange land became less strange. It became human knowledge. Yet the costs were real. Every extra person meant another mouth to feed. Every child carried meant slower movement. Every injury could force a decision between compassion and survival. Every old person required care, but might also hold the memory of dry seasons, roots, and forgotten water. These are not minor details. They are the living mechanics of migration. A map can draw an arrow from Africa into another region, but the arrow does not show a crying child, a tired mother, a cut foot, a fever, a missed herd, or the fear of sleeping when no one knows the night sounds. The arrow also does not show the acts that made survival possible. Sharing meat, carrying fire, waiting for the slowest, dividing tasks, teaching toolmaking, watching over sleep, and remembering where the land had once been kind. This is why human weakness may have been as important as human strength. Because people were fragile, they needed each other. Because they needed each other, they built a kind of moving shelter made of relationships. The group became the protection that the body did not have. Unlike claws, thick fur, or great speed, cooperation could travel, memory could travel, care could travel, fire and tools could travel. The African origin of Homo sapiens had already joined these things together. When some descendants moved outward, they were not taking only muscles and bones into new lands. They were taking a way of surviving that made vulnerable bodies more capable than they looked. The question, then, is not only how humans could walk out of Africa, it is how they could carry dependency across distance without letting it destroy them. The answer begins with the strange human arrangement in which weakness creates connection, connection preserves knowledge, and knowledge makes the next step possible. Without that arrangement, endurance would have been only exhaustion. With it, a fragile group could move slowly through changing worlds and still remain a human future. For Homo sapiens to leave Africa in a lasting way, the group had to be stronger than the individual. This may be one of the deepest biological truths in the story. A single human body is easily damaged by distance. It becomes thirsty, hungry, cold, overheated, frightened, infected, or lost. It cannot remember every route. It cannot watch every direction. It cannot carry all tools, all food, all children, and all fire by itself. But a group can divide these burdens. A group can spread attention across many eyes. It can carry knowledge in different minds. It can allow one person to rest while another watches. It can keep a child alive long enough for that child to learn. This was not a small advantage. It may have been the condition that allowed African humans to cross into worlds where no single person could have survived for long alone. The body made walking possible, but social life made walking meaningful. Without the group, endurance would end in exhaustion. With the group, distance could become a chain of shared tasks. Someone knew how to shape stone. Someone knew how to find water after rain. Someone could carry a sleeping child. Someone could remember a safer camp. Someone could notice animal movement before others did. Someone could stay near the fire while others searched for food. These small acts did not look like history, but they created the possibility of history. The movement out of Africa was not carried by muscles alone. It was carried by coordination. In the African beginning of Homo sapiens, this coordination had already been tested many times. Groups had lived through shifting water, changing food, injury, birth, childhood, loss, and seasonal movement. They had learned that survival was not simply a matter of being strong today. It was a matter of keeping enough people alive for tomorrow's knowledge to exist. If a skilled elder died before teaching a route, the route could vanish from the group. If children died before learning local foods, the future narrowed. If adults refused to share, one person's success might not become the group's survival. Cooperation was not perfect, and it should not be romanticized. Ancient people surely faced conflict, fear, scarcity, and hard choices. But the basic structure of human life made some level of cooperation necessary. A species with helpless children, long learning, and fragile bodies could not depend only on isolated strength. This is why the outward movement beyond Africa must be imagined at the pace of families and small bands. Not only hunters, every new place had to be tested by the whole group. Could children sleep there? Could water be found? Could tools be made or carried in? Could food be shared? Could the old keep up, or could their knowledge justify the slower pace? Could the group remain connected to others enough to find partners and exchange information? These questions shape the real limits of expansion. A route may look open in climate terms, but if it scattered people too widely, the social body could weaken. A new camp may have food, but if it cut the group off from other groups for too long, future generations could become vulnerable. Movement required not only landscapes that allowed walking, but human networks that allowed continuity. This is where biology and society meet. The human body could carry tools because the hands were free. It could walk because the legs and feet allowed long movement. It could cool itself by sweating. But the body also demanded protection because children were slow to mature and adults could be disabled by small injuries. The solution was not in the body alone. It was in the shared life around the body. When African humans moved outward, they carried this shared life with them. They carried the ability to turn separate weaknesses into collective strength. That does not mean leaving Africa was easy or guaranteed. Many groups may have failed. Some movements may have stopped. Some children may have been born in places their descendants did not keep. Yet, where cooperation held, where memory was passed on, and where enough bodies survived together, the human range could widen. The biological price of being human was dependence. The historical power of being human was that dependence could become connection. And through connection, a fragile African species could begin to make distance survivable. A stone tool is easy to misunderstand when it lies alone in a museum case or in a photograph from an excavation. It can look like a hard object, simple and silent, a shaped edge from a world before writing. But for early Homo sapiens, a tool was not only stone, it was memory held in the hand. It was a gesture learned from someone else. It was a way of turning a difficult landscape into something slightly more survivable. When we ask why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago, tools matter because they remind us that people did not move with their bodies alone. They moved with learned methods. A sharp flake could cut meat, scrape hide, shape wood, open plants, or help prepare food for children and older people. A pointed tool could make hunting more possible. A scraper could make skins more useful. A hammerstone could break bone from marrow, releasing fat and energy that mattered deeply in hungry times. These objects were small, but they changed the relationship between the body and the world. The hand did not need to be a claw if it could hold an edge. The tooth did not need to tear everything if stone could cut first. The body did not need to be naturally protected if hide, fire, and shelter could be prepared. This is why tools belong in the story of leaving Africa. They did not make humans invincible, but they gave fragile bodies more ways to answer new problems. The origin of Homo sapiens in Africa was also the origin of many forms of practical knowledge carried through generations. A tool is never just the object itself. It includes knowing where good stone can be found, how to strike it, how much force to use, which shape is useful, when an edge is too dull, how to repair or replace it, and how to teach another hand to make something similar. That knowledge lives socially. A child watching an adult strike stone is not only seeing work, the child is watching the past enter the future. A group moving across African landscapes could carry tools, but more importantly it could carry the ability to remake them. This matters outside Africa, because no group could carry everything forever. Tools break, wood rots, edges dull, fire can die, Food runs out, but if people carry knowledge, they can rebuild parts of their world in new places. In this sense, technology allowed humans to carry a piece of home without carrying the whole landscape. Fire is another example. It was warmth, light, protection, cooking, gathering, and time after sunset. It made some foods easier to chew and digest. It may have helped keep predators away. It allowed people to sit together when darkness reduced the useful day. A group with fire did not simply have heat, it had a center. It had a place where children could stay close, where adults could share food, where stories and warnings could be repeated, where memory could become social. If movement stretched the human world beyond familiar ground, fire helped make unfamiliar ground less empty. It turned a camp into a temporary home. Yet fire, like stone tools, was not magic. It required fuel, attention, dry material, skill, and cooperation. In a wet place, fire could be hard to keep. In a dry place, fuel could be scarce. In a windy place, it could be difficult to control. Every new environment asked the old skill to adapt. That is the deeper point. Tools and fire did not explain leaving Africa by themselves. They became important because they could be adjusted. They allowed African humans to meet new landscapes with more than bare need. A coastline offered shells, but tools helped open and process food. An animal carcass offered meat and marrow, but stone edges made it more useful. A cold night demanded shelter and warmth, but fire and prepared materials changed the body's chances. A long route demanded carrying, cutting, repairing, and remembering. The outward movement of Homo sapiens was therefore not only a biological journey, it was a journey of learned actions. Each camp contained more than people. It contained techniques, habits, experiments, and corrections. Some worked, some failed. Some were changed by local materials. Some were forgotten if the group became too small or if teachers died before children learned enough. So when humans moved beyond Africa, they did not carry a complete answer to the world. They carried a way of making answers. That may have been one of the most important inheritances from their African beginning. Not a single perfect tool, but the ability to keep reshaping tools. Fire, food, and shelter as the edge of the known world moved. When people entered a new landscape, they could not bring Africa's rivers, grasslands, lake edges, or coastlines with them. They could not carry the exact animals they knew, or the same plants, or the same stones arranged in the same places. But they could carry something quieter and more powerful, ways of doing things. A group could carry the memory of how to strike stone, how to keep fire alive, how to cut meat before it's spoiled, how to scrape a hide until it became useful, how to divide food so children and weaker people could continue. This is why tools were more than objects. They were a portable relationship with the world. They allowed humans to meet difference without being completely helpless before it. If a new place had unfamiliar animals, a sharp edge could still cut. If a new coast offered shells, learned hands could still open, sort, and prepare food. If a cold night came earlier than expected, fire, shelter, and treated materials could help the body endure what bare skin could not. The African origin of Homo sapiens mattered because many of these habits had been shaped inside Africa's changing environments before the wider expansion took hold. People had already learned that survival often depended on taking something from one setting and adjusting it in another. A tool made from one kind of stone might need to be remade from another. A way of processing food might need to change when the plant or animal changed. A camp arrangement that worked near a lake might not work as well on an open plain or a windy coast. The important ability was not simply repeating the past. It was carrying the past carefully enough that it could be changed without being lost. This is one of the deep differences between an animal entering a new range and a human group entering one. The human group entered with a memory system that lived outside the body. Stone tools, fire use, shared techniques, paths, and food habits all acted like extensions of memory. They did not replace the mind, but they helped the mind survive across generations. A child did not have to discover everything alone. The child could watch an adult choose stone, hold it at a certain angle, strike it, examine the edge, and use it. The child could see which wood fed a fire well, which smoke was too thick, which food needed cooking, which bones could be cracked, which skins could be softened. These repeated lessons made the group larger than any single person's experience. When people moved farther from the old African landscapes, this shared memory became a kind of invisible shelter. It did not stop hunger or danger, but it gave the group more possible answers. A place without a ready-made shelter could be made more livable. A carcass too tough for teeth could be opened with stone. A dark night could be gathered around flame. A route through uncertain country could be remembered if enough people survived to speak of it again. This is why the movement out of Africa should not be imagined as bodies crossing empty space. It was learned life crossing space. Yet the same point must be kept honest. Tools did not guarantee success. Fire could go out. Good stone could be hard to find. A group could lose a skilled maker. Children might not live long enough to learn enough. Isolation could weaken tradition. In deep time, knowledge is fragile because it must be carried by living people. If the chain of teaching breaks, an ability can fade. If a group becomes too small, there may be fewer hands to learn and fewer minds to remember. So technology helped humans leave Africa only because it remained connected to social life. A blade without teaching is only a sharp object for a short time. Fire without attention becomes ash. A camp without shared memory becomes just a place where people once slept. The lasting power came from the way tools, fire, and people held each other together. This turns the idea of leaving Africa into something more patient. Humans did not carry home as a place. They carried home as practice. They carried ways to make food safer, nights warmer, distance more manageable, and unfamiliar ground less silent. Each time these practices worked in a new place, the human world stretched a little farther. Each time they were taught to a child born beyond the old range, Africa's long beginning continued in another landscape. So the question is not only what pushed people outward, it is also what allowed them to make the next place feel survivable enough to remain. It is tempting to imagine human technology as a sudden breakthrough, as if one invention opened the world and sent Homo sapiens outward. But deep history is usually slower than that. A tool tradition does not become powerful because one person has one clever idea. It becomes powerful when a useful action can be repeated, corrected, remembered, and taught. The stone edge matters, but so does the hand that knows how to make it. The hand matters, but so does the watching child. The child matters, but so does the group that keeps the child alive long enough to learn. This is why tools and fire should not be treated as magical explanations for leaving Africa. They were part of a longer human method. Try, remember, share, adjust, and carry forward. Inside Africa, where Homo sapiens had already lived through changing water, food, animals, and seasons, this method would have been tested again and again. A way of cutting meat might work in one setting, then need to change when animals were different. A scraper might be useful for one hide, then less useful for another. A fire practice might work near dry wood, then require new patience in damp ground or windy country. What mattered was not perfection. What mattered was the ability to preserve enough knowledge while changing enough behavior. That balance may have been one of the quiet strengths behind later expansion. When humans moved into unfamiliar lands, they did not need a complete plan for every place ahead. They needed a system for learning from each place without losing the old skills that had brought them there. This system lived in daily life. An adult shaped stone while others watched. Food was cut, shared, cooked, or stored for a short time. A damaged edge was replaced. A child was shown how to hold a tool without wasting it. A fire was protected from wind. Ashes were searched for remaining heat. These acts were small, but together they made knowledge durable. In a world without writing, repetition was the archive. The body remembered through practice. The group remembered through teaching. A camp remembered through the objects left behind, and the habits repeated there. The African beginning of humans was therefore not only a place of anatomy, but a place where shared learning became part of survival. This is important because migration can break knowledge. A group moving too far too quickly may lose access to familiar stone, wood, plants, animals, and water. A group too small may lose skilled teachers. A group cut off from others may have fewer chances to exchange ideas or partners. So the expansion beyond Africa required more than tools. It required continuity around tools. It required enough people to keep traditions alive, enough contact to prevent knowledge from narrowing too much, and enough flexibility to reshape habits when the environment demanded it. Some earlier movements beyond Africa may have failed partly because this chain did not hold under pressure. Later movements may have endured because the chain held more often or because roots and population supported it better. We should be cautious here because the evidence does not allow one clean cause, but the logic is clear. Learned behavior only helps if it survives across generations. A stone tool in one hand is temporary. A tool-making tradition in a community can move through time. Fire in one camp can die overnight. Fire knowledge in a group can be rebuilt again and again. This is why technology becomes part of ancestry. It is not inherited in the bones like eye sockets or teeth, but it travels with people through attention, memory, and teaching. When African humans moved beyond Africa, they carried this non-biological inheritance with them. It helped them make new camps, process unfamiliar foods, endure colder nights or drier stretches, and turn distant ground into something less unknowable. Yet it remained fragile, because every piece of it depended on living people. The story of leaving Africa is therefore not a story of one invention unlocking the world. It is the slower story of knowledge becoming portable. It is the story of a species whose hands could make tools, whose fires could gather people, whose children could learn for years, and whose groups could carry practical memory farther than any single body could walk alone. A small group can look almost powerless against deep history. A few families moving through dry ground, resting near water, carrying children, tools, and memories, do not seem large enough to change the future of the species. Yet human expansion often begins at this scale. It does not require a whole people to move at once. It requires only that some groups move, survive, have children, and remain connected enough for life to continue. When we ask why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago, population size matters because movement is never only about distance. It is also about continuity. A group can walk far and still vanish. A group can reach a new landscape and still leave no descendants. A group can survive one generation and fail in the next. The real question is not only how people moved beyond Africa's edge, but how enough human life remained unbroken after the movement began. The African beginning of Homo sapiens had already taught this lesson in many forms. Populations inside Africa were not one single crowd living together. They were scattered across different landscapes, separated and reconnected by climate, rivers, dry zones, coastlines, and time. Some groups may have lived apart for long periods, developing local habits and local knowledge. Wetter phases may have allowed contact again. People could meet, exchange partners, share techniques, notice different tools, or learn routes from others. This structure matters because a human population is not only a number of bodies, it is a network of memory. If the network is too thin, knowledge can break. If it is dense enough, knowledge can travel farther than any one person. A small moving group needed more than courage. It needed enough people to care for children, enough adults to find food, enough partners for future generations, enough skilled hands to make tools, and enough remembered knowledge to recover after mistakes. This is why the size and connection of populations may have helped decide which movements endured. Earlier movements beyond Africa may have reached new places, but if the groups were too small or too isolated, their future could become fragile. A harsh season could reduce them, a disease could pass through them, a lost elder could take an important route into silence, a shortage of partners could narrow the next generation. A failed hunt could matter more when there were few people to absorb loss. In such conditions, disappearance does not require a dramatic disaster. It can happen quietly, through fewer births, fewer children surviving, fewer memories passed on, and fewer camps returning to life. Later movements may have succeeded not because the people were fundamentally different in a simple way, but because the chain of population held more strongly. Perhaps there were more groups along the route. Perhaps contact between groups remained possible for longer. Perhaps landscapes provided enough stopping places that people did not become isolated too quickly. Perhaps social knowledge had become more stable, allowing small communities to rebuild after difficulty. None of this needs to be imagined as a planned expansion. It can be imagined as a living net, slowly stretching outward. One group moves toward a river, another remains near a coast, a third uses a seasonal corridor. They may not all know one another, but if movement and contact continue over generations, the human presence becomes harder to erase. This changes the meaning of a small band. A small band is fragile by itself, but it can be part of a larger pattern. Its children may meet the children of another group. Its tools may resemble those learned elsewhere. Its stories about water may travel through marriage, exchange, or shared camps. Its success may depend on people it does not see every day. The origin of humans in Africa was already social in this extended sense. Human beings survived not as isolated families alone, but through overlapping relationships, remembered paths, and repeated contact when conditions allowed. To leave Africa in a lasting way, that older pattern had to stretch beyond the continent's edge. If the stretch was too thin, it could snap. If it held, even loosely, people could move farther while still belonging to a wider human world. This is why population is not a dry scientific detail in this story. It is the difference between a journey and an ancestry. A footprint can be left by one person. A future requires children, partners, teaching, memory, and time. The humans who moved outward carried small lives, but those lives were tied to larger structures, and when enough of those ties survived, a few steps beyond the known world could become the beginning of a human presence that did not disappear. Small groups carry a strange danger inside them. They can move more easily than large populations, but they can also disappear more easily. A few families can travel lightly, choose a new camp quickly, follow animals, adjust to a river, or leave a place that no longer feeds them. But the same smallness that gives movement its flexibility also makes survival fragile. If too many children die, the future narrows. If too few adults remain, food becomes harder to find. If there are too few partners, the next generation becomes uncertain. If an elder dies before passing on a remembered route, a piece of the landscape can vanish from human knowledge. This is why the story of humans leaving Africa cannot be told only through open corridors and moving feet. It must also be told through the risks of being few. A route may be possible, a coast may offer food, a river valley may guide movement, and still a human group may fail if its population is too thin to carry life forward. The origin of Homo sapiens in Africa had already joined movement to social continuity. Human beings were never only bodies crossing land. They were families, related groups, teaching networks, and fragile lines of memory. A person could know where water was, but if that person died before others learnt it, the knowledge died too. A skilled toolmaker could shape stone, but if no child watched closely enough, the skill weakened. A group could find a good camp, but if children did not survive there, the camp became only a temporary trace. Population structure sounds distant, but in deep history it means very ordinary things. Who is alive? Who can teach? Who can care? Who can mate? Who can remember? And who will still be there when the season turns? Earlier movements beyond Africa may have reached real places and lasted for real generations, yet still remained vulnerable in this way. A small group outside the main network of other human groups could become isolated. Isolation might protect them from some dangers, but it could also reduce the flow of partners, stories, techniques, and warnings. If a climate shift made the land drier, there might be no neighbouring group close enough to reconnect with. If illness or hunger reduced numbers, there might be too few people to recover. If one generation lost too many skilled adults, practical knowledge could become thinner. This does not require a dramatic collapse. A population can fade slowly. Fewer births, fewer surviving children, shorter memories, narrower choices. Over time, a group that once seemed settled can leave almost nothing behind. This is one reason the later expansion out of Africa may have depended on more than the ability to enter new lands. It may have depended on whether moving groups remained part of a wider human web. They needed enough contact to avoid becoming too alone, enough distance to find new resources, and enough continuity to keep traditions alive. That balance is delicate. Too much separation could make a group fragile. Too much crowding could strain food and water. The human path outward may have followed the spaces where small groups could spread without completely losing one another. A coast, a chain of rivers, or a series of greener zones could allow this kind of loose connection. One group might not meet another every day, or even every season, but occasional contact could matter deeply. A shared camp, a marriage partner, a copied tool-making habit, a warning about a dry stretch, or news of animals beyond a ridge could strengthen survival. In this sense, the population was not just moving across space. It was trying not to break apart while moving. The children were the measure of whether the movement mattered. Adults could cross a difficult route and leave no lasting history if children did not live to inherit it. But if children survived, learned, and later raised children of their own, the new place became more than a stop. It became part of the human range. The African beginning travelled through these children. It travelled through their bodies, but also through what they were taught. Where to search, how to cut, when to wait, what to fear, and how to live with others. A small group could therefore become the seed of a wider future only if it protected both life and learning. Without enough people, memory thinned. Without memory, movement became dangerous. Without children, movement ended. This is why the risk of small populations is central to the question of leaving Africa. The problem was not simply reaching the outside world. The problem was remaining human there long enough for the next generation to make it home. For a small human group, survival was never only a matter of today. It was a matter of whether today could be carried into tomorrow. A fire that burns for one night gives warmth, but a fire-making skill passed to children gives continuity. A path followed once may save a hungry group, but a path remembered by many people can become part of a wider human range. This is why population structure matters so deeply in the story of leaving Africa. The movement outward did not become important only because some people reached new land. It became important when enough people, across enough generations, remained connected to keep life and knowledge from breaking apart. A group might be small in number, but if it was linked to other groups through marriage, seasonal meetings, shared routes, or remembered places, it was not completely alone. It belonged to a larger human fabric. That fabric could stretch. If it stretched too far, it could tear. If it held even loosely, it allowed fragile groups to keep moving while still receiving new people, new knowledge, and new chances. The African beginning of Homo sapiens had already depended on this kind of fabric. Across Africa, human populations were likely separated and reconnected many times by climate, distance, water, and changing landscapes. Some groups lived near rivers, some near coasts, some near lakes, some in open or wooded regions. Their daily lives were local, but their long-term survival may have depended on wider contact. When conditions improved, routes could open. People could meet again. A tool-making habit might spread. A remembered water source might become known to another group. Partners could be found beyond the closest camp. These connections did not need to be constant to matter. Even occasional contact could keep a population from becoming too narrow. When some descendants moved beyond Africa's edge, that old pattern had to continue in a more difficult form. A new place might feed a group for a while, but if the group became too isolated, the danger changed. Hunger was not the only threat. Forgetting was a threat. Too few partners was a threat. Too few children surviving was a threat. Too few teachers was a threat. The future of a moving population depended on whether its social world could remain wide enough to support it. This helps explain why earlier movements could fade, while later movements endured. Perhaps some early groups reached beyond Africa but became thinly spread in difficult landscapes. Perhaps roots closed behind them. Perhaps climate changed before their networks were strong enough. Perhaps they lived for many generations, but not enough of their descendants remained to become part of later human ancestry. Later movements may have differed because the human web stretched more successfully. There may have been enough groups moving through connected spaces, enough children surviving, enough exchange between neighbouring bands, and enough shared knowledge to prevent the chain from breaking. This was not a planned migration. It was continuity built from repeated survival. One group could settle near a river, another could live near a coast, another could move between seasonal water sources. If these groups remained loosely connected, the human presence became more resilient. Loss in one place did not erase everything. Knowledge in one group could reach another. Children born in one camp could later join lives with children from another. In this way, population became memory distributed across space. No single mind had to hold the whole map. No single family had to carry the whole future. The larger pattern held the possibility of recovery. This is one of the quiet mechanisms behind a lasting expansion out of Africa. The people who moved did not need to be many in one place. They needed enough connection across many places. They needed a chain of births, meetings, teachings, and returns. They needed the human beginning to remain alive not only inside bodies, but between bodies. That is what made movement different from disappearance. A group that walks far and loses its children leaves a trace at most. A group that walks far and raises children who remember how to live there has changed the human world. So the story of leaving Africa is not only about roots, food, climate, or tools. It is also about generations holding on to one another across distance. The map of humanity widened when small groups stopped being isolated sparks and became a slow, spreading fire of connected lives. The roots out of Africa were not roads waiting for human feet. They were living margins, opening and closing with water, climate, animals, and time. When we look at a modern map, the movement can seem obvious. Africa lies near the Arabian Peninsula. The Nile runs northward. The Sinai connects land to land. The Red Sea has narrow points and long coasts. The Eastern Mediterranean opens toward Western Asia. From above, it is tempting to draw arrows and imagine people simply following them. But ancient people did not move from above. They moved at ground level, where every mile had to be judged by thirst, food, shelter, danger, and the strength of the group. A passage only mattered if it could be lived through slowly. A coastline only mattered if it offered enough food and water. A river only mattered if it remained useful when the group arrived. This is why the routes out of Africa should be imagined not as highways, but as chains of survivable places. One chain may have followed the Nile and the northeastern edge of Africa toward the Sinai and the Levant. In wetter periods, landscapes that are now harsh could have held more water, vegetation, and animals. Such conditions might have allowed human groups to move northward through corridors that were not always open. Another possible path may have involved the southern Red Sea region, where coastal and near-coastal movement could have connected parts of northeastern Africa with Arabia when conditions were favorable. Other routes may have followed shores, river systems, lake margins, or temporary green zones that appeared and faded across deep time. None of these possibilities should be treated as a single certain line. The evidence is partial, and the ancient world left its records unevenly. Stone tools can remain where bodies do not. Bones can disappear where camps once stood. Coastlines from the past may now be underwater because sea levels changed. A place that was once a usable shore may no longer be visible to us in the same way. This makes the story quieter, not weaker. It reminds us that the people who moved did not need a perfect route. They needed enough connected moments of survival. The African origin of Homo sapiens matters again here, because these routes were not only geographic openings, they were tests of African knowledge in new sequences of land. People who knew how to read water, animal movement, stone, firewood, and seasonal food could turn a corridor into a lived path. Without that knowledge, a corridor was only empty space. A green passage across a dry region might look inviting, but if it lacked reliable water in the wrong season, it could become a trap. A coast might seem generous, but only to people who understood tides, shellfish, fish, birds, and nearby fresh water. A river might guide movement, but also gather predators, insects, and other dangers. So every possible exit from Africa was not only a way out. It was a question asked of the human group. Can you keep children alive here? Can you find food tomorrow? Can you remember the last water? Can you make tools from what this place offers? Can you continue without breaking apart? The answer may have differed from one period to another. In one climate window, a northern route may have been easier. In another, coastal movement may have been more practical. At times, groups may have moved outward and then stopped, returned, mixed, or vanished. At other times, the chain of usable places may have extended farther, allowing children to be born beyond the old range and grow up with a new sense of home. This is why the route out of Africa cannot be reduced to one arrow. It was more like a breathing edge, expanding when landscapes softened and contracting when dryness returned. Human beings moved with that edge when they could. They did not cross from origin to destiny in one clean gesture. They followed water, shore, animals, memory, and chance through places that were only sometimes open. And in those temporary openings, the human world began to widen. The evidence for the routes out of Africa does not come from one kind of trace. It comes from several imperfect windows placed beside one another. Archaeology gives stone tools, campsites, shells, pigments, bones, hearths, and the marks of human hands on materials that survived. Fossils give rare glimpses of bodies, but bodies are easily lost to time. Genetics gives another kind of map, not a map of roads, but a map of ancestry, mixing, separation, and survival carried inside living people and ancient remains when they can be recovered. Climate studies add still another layer, showing when deserts may have been greener, when lakes existed, when coastlines were different, and when routes may have been more open or more closed. None of these sources is complete by itself. A tool can show that people were present, but not always who they were. A fossil can show a body, but not the full story of the group around it. DNA can show relationship and descent, but not every place a person walked. Ancient climate can suggest possibility, but possibility is not the same as proof. This is why the routes out of Africa must be described carefully. They are not guesses without evidence, but they are also not simple lines drawn with certainty. The ancient world speaks in fragments. The work is to listen to the fragments without forcing them into a story that is too clean. A northern route through northeastern Africa, the Sinai, and the Levant has long drawn attention because it connects Africa to Western Asia through land. In periods when the region was wetter, this path may have offered water, animals, and vegetation enough for human groups to move through slowly. The Levant, in particular, has yielded traces of early human presence at different times, reminding us that this region was not merely a corridor but a meeting ground, a place where African populations and Eurasian landscapes came close. Yet a route that works in one period can fail in another. Dryness could turn connected spaces into barriers. A group might enter, live for generations, and then disappear or retreat when conditions changed. A southern or coastal route near the Red Sea and into Arabia has also been considered, especially because coasts can offer repeated foods and long directional edges. But coastlines from deep time are difficult to study because sea levels have changed. Some places people may have used are now underwater. What looks like absence may sometimes be lost evidence, not absence of people. Arabia itself was not always the dry land we picture today. At different times it held lakes, rivers, grasslands, and animal life that could have supported human movement. Such windows would have made it not just a harsh barrier, but a changing bridge. The African origin of Homo sapiens is essential here because people could only use these routes if their inherited skills matched the opportunities. A greener Arabia, a Nile corridor, a Levantine passage, or a coastal margin did not guarantee survival. The group still had to find water in the correct season, recognize usable foods, shape tools from local stone, keep social life intact, and raise children far from familiar centers. This means archaeology and genetics are really pointing toward lived problems. A shell midden, a stone flake, a fossil tooth, or a genetic signal is not just a data point. It is the remains of thirst managed for one more day, food processed by hands, children kept alive, people meeting or separating, and knowledge surviving long enough to leave a trace. The routes out of Africa were therefore not only physical spaces, they were tests of continuity. When evidence is sparse, we should not fill the silence with fantasy, but we also should not mistake silence for emptiness. Some groups may have passed through places that left almost nothing behind. Some camps may have been destroyed by erosion, buried deeply, or drowned by rising seas. Some populations may have lived and vanished without becoming major ancestors of later people. What remains is uneven, yet the unevenness itself teaches caution. It shows that human expansion was probably not a single clean event, but a pattern of attempts, pauses, openings, closures, and survivals. Each route was partly a landscape and partly a question. Could the African human way of life continue here? Could the group remain connected enough, fed enough, and remembered enough to become more than a passing trace? The answer was not always yes. But when it was, the edge of Africa became the beginning of a wider human world. A route out of Africa was never a single line. It was a changing chain of places where human life could continue for a little while longer. This is why the old image of one great arrow crossing from Africa into the rest of the world is too simple. An arrow suggests direction, purpose, and smooth movement. The real movement was probably uneven. People may have moved northward during one climate window, paused in the Levant, retreated or mixed when conditions changed, then moved again later through a different opening. Others may have followed coastlines, river valleys, or greener regions in Arabia when water and animals made those places livable. Some paths may have worked for a few generations and then closed. Some groups may have reached new lands and left no lasting descendants. Others may have become connected to later waves of movement. The map of human expansion was not drawn once. It was redrawn by climate, sea levels, water sources, food, population contact, and time. At ground level, this would not have felt like a grand migration. It would have felt like finding the next place where children could drink, where tools could be made, where animals or shellfish could be found, where the night could be survived. This is the important difference between a route and a lived path. A route is something we draw after the fact. A lived path is made slowly, by bodies that must eat and rest. For Homo sapiens, the route out of Africa could only exist if each stage offered enough support. A desert edge might become passable during wetter periods, but not during dry ones. A coastline might offer food, but only if fresh water could be found nearby. A river corridor might lead people onward, but it could also become crowded, dangerous, or unreliable. A grassland opened by rain might invite animals and people, then vanish again when the climate shifted. This means that leaving Africa was not one movement through permanent doors. It was a movement through temporary openings. Some doors opened, some closed, and human groups had to live with that uncertainty. The African beginning of our species had prepared people for this kind of world, not by giving them a perfect map, but by giving them a way to survive without one. They had learned to read signs. A track in mud, a change in vegetation, the direction of birds, the smell of water, the dryness of wind, the quality of stone, the behavior of animals near dusk. Such signs could guide movement more powerfully than any abstract sense of geography. A person did not need to know where a continent ended. The group only needed to know whether the next valley, shore, or basin could support life. Over many generations, these local judgments could become a vast expansion. One family's familiar camp became another generation's starting point. One remembered water source became a link in a chain. One temporary shelter became a place where children were born. This is how the edge of the human world could move without anyone seeing the whole pattern. The routes out of Africa were also shaped by loss. We do not see every camp that existed. We do not recover every body. We do not know every shoreline people may have followed, because some ancient coasts now lie beneath the sea. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but caution must work both ways. We cannot fill every missing place with certainty. The honest story is that several routes may have mattered at different times, and their importance may have changed as climates changed. The northern passages through the Nile, Sinai, and Levant may have served some movements. Arabian landscapes, when wetter, may have served others. Coastal margins may have helped people move gradually along long edges of land and water. These possibilities do not cancel one another. They remind us that human expansion was probably braided, not straight. Different groups may have tried different edges of the world. Some threads broke, some joined, some faded, some continued. By the time later descendants spread farther into Eurasia and beyond, the movement had already become larger than one path. It had become a pattern of survival stretched across space. So when we ask why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago, the route is not the answer by itself. The route is the place where many answers met. Climate, food, water, tools, children, memory, and population connection. A path opened only when the land allowed life and the people could carry life into it. That is why the journey beyond Africa should be seen not as a clean escape, but as a slow widening of the human world through openings that were always uncertain, temporary, and deeply dependent on the African knowledge carried by those who moved. When Homo sapiens moved beyond Africa, they did not enter an empty world. This is one of the most important corrections to the simple migration story. The lands beyond Africa were not waiting silently for modern humans to arrive. Other kinds of humans had lived in parts of Eurasia before them, with their own long histories, their own adaptations, their own ways of making tools, finding food, enduring cold, and belonging to landscapes that Homo sapiens did not yet know. Neanderthals had lived across parts of Western Eurasia for a very long time. Denisovans, known more faintly through fossils and genetic evidence, were also part of this wider human world. There may have been other groups whose traces remain limited or still unknown. So leaving Africa was not only a movement into new geography, it was a movement into a world where humanity was already plural. This matters because it changes the emotional shape of the story. Homo sapiens did not simply walk from origin into emptiness and fill the map. They entered regions where other humans had already solved some of the problems of local survival in their own ways. In colder places, Neanderthals had bodies and habits shaped by generations of life outside Africa. They knew animals, seasons, stone sources, shelters, and risks that incoming Homo sapiens would have had to learn. The world beyond Africa was therefore not only strange because of climate and land, it was strange because some of its human histories had begun long before our ancestors arrived there. The African beginning of Homo sapiens remained central, but it was no longer the only human beginning present in the story. A group moving through the Levant or deeper into Eurasia could have encountered traces of other people even before meeting them directly, worked stone, used shelters, old camps, hunted animals, or pathways through useful terrain. We should be careful here, because deep time does not let us turn every encounter into a clear scene. We do not know the tone of each meeting. Some contacts may have been distant, some may have involved avoidance, some may have involved competition over animals, water, or shelter. Some may have involved exchange, copying, or even social contact close enough for children to be born between groups. The evidence from human ancestry today suggests that some interbreeding happened between Homo sapiens and other human populations after movements out of Africa. But this should not be told as a simple romance, a simple war, or a simple replacement. The truth was probably uneven, local, and different from place to place. When resources were abundant, neighbouring groups might have tolerated one another more easily. When climate tightened food and shelter, the same landscape could become more tense. A cave, a valley, a river crossing, or a herd migration path might matter to more than one human group at once. This adds another layer to the question of why humans left Africa. To move outward was not only to manage water, food, tools, and children. It was also to enter a human environment already shaped by others. A new group had to learn not only the land, but perhaps the presence of other minds watching the same land. Yet Homo sapiens carried certain strengths from Africa into these encounters. They carried social learning, long childhood, flexible tools, fire, memory, and the ability to live in connected groups. Other humans had their own strengths. Neanderthals, for example, were not crude shadows waiting to vanish. They were skilled, enduring humans of their own kind, shaped by environments where Homo sapiens were newcomers. Seeing them this way keeps the story honest. The expansion beyond Africa was not the arrival of real humans into a non-human world. It was one branch of humanity meeting other branches. Some branches mixed, some disappeared. Some left faint signals in the bodies of later people. The movement out of Africa therefore becomes more mysterious, not less. It asks how Homo sapiens survived not only new climates, but a world of other human histories. It asks how an African species, carrying its own beginning, entered places where being human already had other forms. Meeting another human group is not the same as meeting a new animal, a new plant, or a new climate. It is stranger than that. Another human group uses the same land with intention. It remembers places, it returns to shelters. It follows animals, chooses stone, keeps watch, protects children, and may understand danger in ways that overlap with your own. When Homo sapiens moved beyond Africa, encounters with Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other human populations would have added a difficult layer to survival. The land was not only filled with food and risk, it was also filled, in some regions, with other beings close enough to be recognized as human in body and behavior, but different enough to carry other histories. We should not imagine these meetings as one kind of event. Deep time almost certainly held many kinds of contact. Some groups may have avoided one another, noticing traces from a distance. A used hearth, broken stone, bones left after butchery, footprints near water, smoke beyond a ridge. Others may have competed quietly for the same shelters, game, wood, or stone. In harsh seasons, Even small overlaps could matter. A valley that fed one group might not feed two. A cave that protected one community through cold nights could become more valuable when weather turned severe. A herd migration path could draw several groups toward the same place at the same time. Yet contact was not only competition. Humans are observant, and useful behavior can travel without full friendship. One group can notice how another uses a landscape. A tool form can be copied. A route can become known. A food source can be recognized because someone else has left signs of using it. There may also have been closer contact. Genetic evidence in people today shows that some Homo sapiens ancestors interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans after leaving Africa. That means at least some encounters were close enough to produce children, and some of those children had descendants. Still, it would be unwise to turn this into a simple, peaceful story. Interbreeding can happen in many social conditions, and the evidence does not tell us the full emotional life of those meetings. What it does tell us is that the human world beyond Africa was not divided by perfect walls. Branches of humanity touched. Some of that contact entered later human ancestry. This matters for the question of leaving Africa because survival outside Africa was not only a matter of adapting to cold, new animals, or unfamiliar plants. It was also a matter of entering an existing human landscape. Neanderthals had lived in many Eurasian regions for far longer than incoming Homo sapiens. They were not beginners there. Their bodies, tools, habits, and local knowledge were shaped by those places. Homo sapiens arriving from African ancestry may have brought flexibility, social learning, and connected population networks, but they were also newcomers. A newcomer must learn. Sometimes learning may come from the land. Sometimes it may come indirectly from other humans already living there. The African beginning remained present in the bodies and habits of Homo sapiens, yet outside Africa that beginning met other solutions to being human. This encounter did not have to be dramatic to be important. A brief meeting, a copied technique, a shared region, a mixed child, a conflict over shelter, a long period of avoidance, any of these could alter the path of a small population. For a group already fragile from travel, the presence of other humans could either increase danger or increase possibility, depending on the moment. If resources were scarce, contact could sharpen pressure. If knowledge moved between groups, contact could soften unfamiliarity. If interbreeding occurred, it could join histories that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. The story becomes larger than migration. It becomes the story of a world where several human lines, shaped by different environments, briefly overlapped. And in that overlap, Homo sapiens did not simply replace a silent world. They entered a living human field, where survival depended on reading not only water, animals, stone, and weather, but also the traces of other people who had their own claim to the land. To leave Africa was to enter a world where being human already had more than one shape. This changes the meaning of the journey in a very quiet way. Homo sapiens did not simply meet new weather, new animals, and new land. They met the traces, and perhaps the living presence of other human histories. In some places, Neanderthals had known the cold, the caves, the valleys, and the movement of animals for far longer than incoming Homo sapiens. In other places, Denisovan-related populations belong to landscapes that are still only partly understood through fragmentary fossils and genetic evidence. These people were not symbols. They were not obstacles placed in a story that already belonged to us. They were human relatives with their own long beginnings, their own inherited skills, and their own ways of surviving outside Africa. When our ancestors moved into Eurasia, they entered a world where the human story had already branched. That fact makes the question of why humans left Africa deeper than a simple search for space. Moving outward meant stepping into contact with difference. Sometimes that difference may have been seen from far away. Smoke above a shelter, stone flakes scattered near a place of work, bones broken in a familiar but not identical way, footprints near water, signs that another group had returned to the same landscape before. Sometimes it may have been closer. A meeting at a river, a shared region during a generous season, a tense overlap during hunger, a copied tool form. A child born from two human lines that had been separate for an immense length of time. We do not know the emotional texture of these moments, and it would be dishonest to pretend that we do. But we can say that the world beyond Africa was not empty. It was already inhabited by human intelligence, human memory, and human need. This matters because contact with other human groups could change both risk and possibility. A new group entering a land might face competition for shelter, animals, fuel, or safe routes, but the same presence of other humans could also reveal that the land was livable. If another human population could survive there, then the place already held food, water, and workable materials. The signs of use could become information. A shelter used before might show where wind was less severe. A concentration of stone tools might show where good material could be found. A pattern of butchery might reveal how animals were processed. Even without direct teaching, humans can learn from traces. This does not mean Homo sapiens simply copied their way into success. It means that the human landscape was layered. Every group carried its own knowledge, and where those groups overlapped, knowledge, genes, pressure, and chance could meet. The African beginning of Homo sapiens remained central in this contact. Our ancestors carried bodies shaped by African environments, social habits built around cooperation, long childhoods, flexible tools, and the ability to maintain wider connections between groups. These traits may have helped them continue in new regions, but other humans also had their strengths. Neanderthals were adapted to many Eurasian conditions. Denisovan-related groups may have been adapted to environments we still understand only partly. The story should not be told as if one group was fully advanced and the others were failed versions waiting to disappear. Deep history is more careful than that. Some branches endured for a long time, some mixed, some faded, some left traces inside later people, not as complete stories, but as fragments of ancestry. The movement out of Africa, therefore, became more than expansion. It became a joining of histories that had once been separate. When Homo sapiens survived outside Africa, part of that survival unfolded in a world of other humans. The question was not only whether African humans could live beyond Africa's climate and food patterns, it was whether they could enter a wider human field and still maintain continuity. Could their children survive near people with different inherited knowledge? Could groups remain connected enough to keep their own traditions while also encountering others? Could contact become danger in one place and possibility in another? These questions do not have one simple answer. They probably had many local answers, changing with season, population size, hunger, distance, and chance. But they remind us that leaving Africa was not a clean movement into silence. It was a passage into a world already marked by human hands. And once Homo sapiens crossed that threshold, the story of our species could no longer be told as the story of one isolated line. It became the story of human branches meeting, overlapping, and leaving behind a future more mixed and more fragile than any simple arrow on a map can show. The question now returns to an earlier mystery. If Homo sapiens had already moved beyond Africa before, why did some later movements leave a much stronger trace? Why did certain human expansions fade into fragments, while others became part of the ancestry of so many people living outside Africa today? This is not a question with one clean answer. It is a question about why a chain did not break. Earlier groups may have reached the Levant, Arabia, or other nearby regions during favorable periods. They may have lived, raised children, made tools, used shelters, and followed animals across lands that were only sometimes open. Their lives were real even if their genetic legacy appears limited or difficult to detect today. But reaching a place is not the same as becoming rooted there. A group can arrive and still remain vulnerable. A climate window can close. A dry corridor can return. A small population can become isolated. Children can fail to survive in sufficient numbers. Contact with related groups can become too rare. Knowledge can thin as elders die and skilled hands disappear. In this way, a human presence can fade without one dramatic ending. The later expansions connected to the broader spread of Homo sapiens may have endured because more of the necessary conditions overlapped at once. Not because the people were suddenly separate from those before them, and not because one invention alone changed everything. The difference may have been a combination of timing, population structure, environmental opportunity, and social continuity. If routes were open for longer, groups could move without becoming immediately trapped. If there were enough neighboring groups, contact could continue across distance. If children survived in new places, Each new birth turned a temporary camp into a stronger human foothold. If tools, fire use, food knowledge, and social care were passed on reliably, unfamiliar ground became less dangerous over time. This brings the story back to the African beginning of our species. Homo sapiens did not leave Africa as a blank population suddenly invented by one event. They carried a long history of adjustment already shaped inside Africa's varied climates and landscapes. They came from populations that had learned to move, pause, reconnect, and adapt. The later movement out of Africa may have mattered more because it carried not only bodies, but a more durable web of living knowledge. A group with knowledge is stronger than a group with objects alone. A group connected to other groups is stronger than a group isolated beyond recovery. A group that can raise children through uncertainty is stronger than a group that only survives the first difficult season. This is why the lasting expansion should not be pictured as a triumphant march. It was probably a fragile continuity that happened to hold. A camp was not abandoned before children learnt it. A route was not forgotten before others used it. A food source was not missed at the wrong season. A neighbouring group was close enough for contact. A tool tradition survived the loss of one maker. A child born beyond Africa's edge grew into an adult who knew that new place as ordinary ground. Small things like these can decide whether a movement disappears or becomes ancestry. From a distance, deep history looks large and inevitable. From inside the group, it would have looked uncertain. There may have been hunger, failed routes, lost people, fear of unknown land, and nights when returning would have seemed safer than continuing. But if enough groups remained alive, if enough children learned, and if enough connections survived between them, the movement could keep extending. That is the difference between an excursion and a lasting expansion. One reaches outward for a moment. The other creates a new human continuity. So when we ask why the trace did not vanish this time, we are asking about more than movement. We are asking why human life held together across distance. The answer begins with a rare overlap. A changing world that opened enough paths, African humans with enough flexible knowledge, and populations connected enough to carry memory beyond the edge without letting it dissolve. The later expansion out of Africa may have depended on several small advantages becoming strong together. None of them needs to be imagined as a miracle. A slightly larger population, a slightly better connected network of groups, a route that stayed open a little longer, a coast or river system that fed people more reliably, a tool tradition that remained stable through hardship. A social habit that helped children survive each of these could seem modest alone, but deep history is often shaped by modest things repeated across generations. A group did not need to master the whole world. It only needed to survive the next difficult season, teach the next child, remember the next water source, and remain connected to enough other people that life did not narrow beyond repair. If that happened again and again, the movement could begin to leave a trace that earlier movements did not. This is why the question of 70,000 years ago should not be reduced to one cause. Climate may have opened corridors, but open ground without people strong enough to use it would mean little. Tools may have helped, but tools without teaching could fade. Food may have pulled people outward, but food without water and safe camps could not sustain children. Population size may have mattered, but numbers without cooperation could still fail. The lasting spread of Homo sapiens was probably a convergence, a meeting of conditions that made continuity more likely than disappearance. The African origin of our species is important because these conditions did not appear from nowhere. They grew from older habits formed inside Africa, moving between changing environments, reading seasons, living in groups, making tools, sharing food, protecting children, and carrying knowledge through long childhoods. When some descendants moved outward, these habits became more than local survival. They became a portable system. Yet a portable system still needed the right landscape. A desert could stop it. A closed corridor could isolate it. A hostile climate shift could reduce a group before its knowledge became rooted. So success required both human flexibility and environmental opportunity. One without the other was not enough. This helps explain why earlier movements may have faded. Perhaps they happened during windows that were too short. Perhaps the groups were too small. Perhaps they became cut off from related populations. Perhaps the land allowed entry but not long continuity. Perhaps children survived for a while, but not enough to make the new region a lasting human centre. Later movements may have encountered a different balance. Routes through northeastern Africa, Arabia, coastal margins, or Western Asia may have been usable in ways that allowed movement to be slow, repeated, and connected. Groups could pause, learn, and move again. A temporary camp could become a known camp. A known camp could become a place where children were born. Those children could grow up with new local knowledge, making the next movement less blind. In this way, expansion could feed on its own continuity. Each successful generation made the next one slightly less alone. This is not the same as progress in a straight line. Some groups may still have vanished. Some knowledge may still have been lost. Some paths may have closed behind the people who used them. But if enough branches survived, the larger pattern remained. The human future outside Africa did not require every movement to succeed. It required enough movements to keep going, enough contact to preserve diversity and knowledge, enough children to carry memory, and enough time for new landscapes to become familiar. That is a very different image from a single wave sweeping across the world. It is slower, more fragile, and more believable. The trace did not vanish because, in some places and periods, the chain held. Bodies endured long enough for memory to deepen. Groups remained connected enough for isolation not to swallow them. The land opened enough spaces for people to live between old and new worlds. African knowledge, carried outward, met new opportunities and changed without breaking. So the stronger mark left by later movements may not come from one dramatic superiority. It may come from a quieter threshold, when climate, population, technology, food, and social life finally overlapped long enough for movement to become ancestry. The strongest trace in human history is not always made by the first people to arrive. It is made by the people whose descendants remain. This is a difficult idea, because it separates arrival from ancestry. A group may reach a new land, live there, know its rivers and shelters, raise children, and still fade from the later human story if the chain of descent does not continue. Another group may arrive later, perhaps not much different in body or skill, but at a moment when more conditions support continuity. Over many generations, that later group can leave a larger mark, not because it was the first, and not because it was destined to succeed, but because its line did not break. This is why the question of why humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago slowly becomes a question about endurance through time. The movement itself mattered, but the survival of the movement mattered more. The African beginning of Homo sapiens had already produced a species capable of movement, learning, cooperation, and adjustment. Yet those abilities needed the right circumstances to become a lasting expansion. If a group moved outward during a short wet period, and then dryness returned too quickly, the route behind them could close. If they entered a new region but remained too few, one harsh season could reduce them beyond recovery. If they lost contact with other groups, they might lose partners, knowledge, and social resilience. If children were born but not enough of them survived, the future would narrow. If useful skills were not taught, the group might still live for a time, but become more vulnerable with each generation. In this sense, deep history is full of almost successes. There may have been many human presences that were real, meaningful, and long enough to matter to those who lived them, yet too fragile to become the mainstream of later ancestry. That should make the later expansion feel less inevitable. The people who carried it were not walking under a guarantee. They were moving through a world where the same dangers that erased earlier groups could still erase them. The difference may have been that in enough places the necessary supports came together. Routes remained usable long enough. Food sources could be learned. Water could be found. Children survived. Groups stayed connected. Tools and fire knowledge continued. Contact with other human populations may have brought risks, but it may also have placed Homo sapiens inside a wider field of information and ancestry. None of these factors alone explains everything. Together, they form a threshold. Once enough groups could live beyond Africa's edge without becoming completely isolated, the movement gained depth. Once children were born into new landscapes and learned them as home, the expansion became less dependent on memory of the old center. Once several groups existed across connected regions, a loss in one place did not end the whole pattern. This is how a fragile spread becomes harder to erase. It becomes distributed. It becomes held by many fires, many camps, many children, many remembered paths. The story of leaving Africa, therefore, cannot be reduced to one heroic cause. It was not simply climate. It was not simply hunger. It was not simply better tools. It was not simply curiosity. It was the rare moment when environmental openings, biological endurance, social care, population connection, and learned knowledge overlapped for long enough. A river corridor or coastline could open the way, but people had to live along it. A useful tool could help, but someone had to teach it. A child could be born in a new land, but adults had to keep that child alive until the land became known through that child's own memory. When these things held together, the trace did not vanish. The movement became ancestry. And perhaps this is the most careful way to understand the turning point. Humans had left Africa before, but around this broader period, some descendants of African populations began to leave in a way that the future could still carry. The journey stopped being only a reach beyond the source. It became a widening of the source itself, spread through living bodies, remembered skills, and generations that did not disappear. When we bring all the earlier pieces together, the question of why humans left Africa becomes less like a search for one cause and more like a long listening to many causes at once. Climate changed the shape of possible life. Food moved with animals, plants, water, tides, and seasons. The human body could travel, but only with care. Tools and fire helped fragile bodies meet unfamiliar problems. Small populations could move outward, but only if enough children, partners, teachers, and remembered paths survived. Routes opened through river valleys, greener passages, coastlines, and regions that were sometimes more livable than they appear today. Other human groups already lived in parts of the world beyond Africa, making the new landscapes not empty, but layered with other human histories. None of these alone explains the movement. Together, they form a quieter answer. Homo sapiens may have left Africa because, over many generations, the safest way to remain alive was no longer always to remain in the same familiar pattern. The old human world did not simply end at Africa's edge. It stretched when the conditions allowed it to stretch. A river led to another river. A coastline continued beyond the known camp. Animals moved through greener ground. A dry season made one place harder, while a distant margin became possible. A child was born where a grandparent had only travelled. Then that child learned the new place as home. This is how movement becomes history without announcing itself. The African beginning of our species remained present in every step. It was present in the walking body, the sweating skin, the carrying hands, the long childhood, the need for cooperation, the use of fire, the shaping of stone, the sharing of food, and the memory of water. The people who moved outward did not leave these things behind. They carried them. That is why the story should not be told, as if humans escaped Africa and became something separate from it. The expansion beyond Africa was not a rejection of the source. It was one way the source continued under changing conditions. In every new landscape, the old African inheritance had to be tested. Could the group find food here? Could children survive here? Could tools be made from local stone? Could fire be kept? Could the cold, dryness, range, coast, forest, valley, or steppe be understood well enough to live through another season? If the answer was no, the movement could fade. If the answer was yes often enough, the human range widened. This makes the story both larger and more humble. Larger, because the movement out of Africa eventually helped create the human world we know today. Humble, because it did not begin as conquest. It began with needs that any body can understand: thirst, hunger, safety, warmth, sleep, care, and the hope that children would wake tomorrow. The map of humanity was not first drawn by ambition. It was drawn by survival, repeated across generations. Around the broad period we call 70,000 years ago, some of these repeated survivals began to hold beyond Africa more strongly than before. The routes were not perfect. The people were not invincible. The outcome was not guaranteed. But enough conditions overlapped for some groups to continue. Climate opened certain spaces. Food made movement possible. Social life protected weakness. Knowledge travelled through hands and memory. Population connections kept groups from becoming too alone. The new world beyond Africa became livable not all at once, but place by place, child by child, camp by camp. So the first part of the final answer is not one word. It is a pattern. Humans left Africa because the living edge of survival moved, and because African humans had become capable of moving with it. They followed not destiny, but connected chances to remain alive. And by doing so, they carried the beginning of humanity into lands where that beginning would slowly become many new homes. There is an important lesson inside this story, and it is not only about the past. The movement out of Africa reminds us that human beings have never been separate from the conditions that hold life together. Our species did not spread because it stood above nature. It spread because it learned, slowly and imperfectly, to live within nature's changes. Water mattered, food mattered, climate mattered, the bodies of children mattered, the memory of older people mattered, the patience of teaching mattered, the ability to share mattered. When these things held together, movement became possible. When they failed, even strong bodies could vanish from history. This is a quiet but useful lesson, because modern people often imagine humanity as something that broke free from the natural world. We live with walls, roads, machines, medicine, stored food, electric light, and maps that show the whole planet at once. It is easy to forget that the deeper human story began with smaller truths: where to sleep, where to drink, what to eat, how to keep children warm, how to remember a path, how to help one another survive a season that did not behave as expected. The people who moved beyond Africa were not masters of the earth. They were careful survivors. They carried skill, but also fear. They carried tools, but also dependence. They carried memory, but also uncertainty. They were not less human because of this fragility. Their fragility was part of what made them human. The African beginning of Homo sapiens teaches that our species was formed not by comfort, but by relationship. The body related to heat, thirst, distance, and hunger. The group related to children, elders, partners, and neighboring groups. The mind related to memory, signs, and repeated learning. The hand related to stone, wood, fire, skin, and food. None of these relationships was complete by itself. Together, they made a living system. When some human groups moved beyond Africa, that system had to be carried into new conditions. It had to meet different animals, different climates, different routes, different human relatives, and different dangers. Sometimes it must have failed. Sometimes it held. The fact that it held often enough is why the story continued into us. This should make the human expansion feel less like a victory march and more like an inheritance. We inherit not only the result of movement, but the method of movement. Paying attention, cooperating, adjusting, remembering, and learning from those who came before. In the ancient world, these habits helped people cross deserts when they were passable, follow coasts when they were useful, stay near rivers when they fed life, and retreat when staying longer became too dangerous. In the modern world, the same lesson still has value, though the setting has changed. Human beings remain dependent on water, climate, food systems, social trust, and shared knowledge. We may carry phones instead of stone tools, but we still live by memory outside the body. We may sleep in houses instead of open camps, but we still need others when the body weakens. We may travel faster than any ancient group could imagine, but movement without care can still break connection. The story of leaving Africa, therefore, does not say that humans are meant to escape every limit. It says that survival depends on understanding limits well enough to live with them. Our ancestors did not carry the whole world in their hands. They carried enough knowledge for the next step, enough trust for the next night, enough food for the next day, and enough care for the next child. Over time, that was enough to change the map of humanity. The lesson is gentle but serious. We are here because many fragile groups did not break. We are here because people shared what they knew before they disappeared. We are here because children learned new lands and made them familiar. And when we look back toward Africa, we are not looking at a place left behind. We are looking at the beginning of the long human habit of surviving by belonging to one another and to the changing earth. The question began with movement, but it ends by turning back toward origin. Why did humans leave Africa 70,000 years ago? The careful answer is that they did not leave in the way a person leaves a house and closes the door. They moved because the living world around them moved. Water shifted, food shifted, climates opened and closed, groups divided and reconnected. And the safest place was not always the same place forever. But the deeper answer is that humans could move because Africa had already shaped them into a species able to carry survival beyond one landscape. The body could walk, sweat, carry, watch and endure. The hand could shape stone and hold firewood. The group could share food, protect children, remember paths, and teach skills slowly across long childhoods. The mind could connect yesterday's danger with tomorrow's choice. These things were not left behind at the edge of the continent. They were the hidden luggage of the human species. Every outward step carried Africa inside it. Every new camp beyond the old range still depended on an African beginning, bodies shaped by African environments, knowledge formed through African change, and social habits strengthened by the long need to survive together. This is why the story should not end with a simple picture of humans spreading across a map. A map shows distance, but it does not show dependence. It does not show the water that had to be found, the child who had to be carried, the tool that had to be remade from unfamiliar stone, the elder whose memory could save a root, or the small group whose future depended on enough births, enough food, and enough trust. The map does not show how uncertain the world still was. Some movements failed, some groups disappeared, some paths closed, some human relatives were met, mixed with, avoided, or lost. Nothing in the story was guaranteed. The survival of Homo sapiens beyond Africa was not destiny unfolding smoothly. It was a fragile chain that happened, in some places not to break. That is the quiet truth beneath the large event. We are not the descendants of every group that moved. We are the descendants of groups whose children lived long enough to inherit new ground. We come from people who did not know they were becoming a world population. They only knew the next hunger, the next dry season, the next camp, the next birth, the next death, the next uncertain route. Over time, those small human moments became the widening of humanity. And still, even after all that movement, Africa remains more than the place humans came from. It remains the first long school of our species. It is where the body learned its basic bargain with the earth. It is where survival became social, where memory became practical, where movement became a way of staying alive without abandoning the past. To say that humans left Africa is true only if we understand that they never left it completely. They carried its lessons into Arabia, the Levant, Asia, Europe, islands, cold lands, forests, coasts, and valleys their ancestors had never seen. The source widened through them. The beginning became portable. Perhaps that is why this question still feels alive. It is not only about an ancient migration. It is about the strange human condition of belonging to a place, yet being able to survive when that place changes. It is about the cost of movement and the memory of origin. It is about a species that could not remain still, but also could not move without carrying what made it human. So when we ask why humans left Africa 70,000 years ago, we may also be asking something quieter. If every journey carries its beginning inside it, then how far can a species really travel from the place that made it?